Do you all remember your first, or I don't know, first, second, third encounters with Lacan? I guess I want to just talk a little bit before we get into the mirror stage, which is the essay we're going to read today. Well, read, discuss, etc. Lacan is this sort of fearsome figure for so many people because his writing is so dense. And I wanted to just see if we can do a little almost reassurance here.
As to the density?
Just that sort of like, it's not you, it's Lacan.
I mean, it probably helps to know that he didn't actually write any of this down, right?
Well, that's not true of what we're reading today, but it's true of the seminars. Yeah, for sure.
And the seminars in particular, it's not just that he didn't necessarily write them down. It's that the things that we have from the seminars were written down by multiple other people in the audience, many of whom heard diametrically opposite things and who have different recordings of what they heard that are controlled by different libraries and estates and factions in like Lacanian, in the Lacanian universe, in the expanded Lacanian universe.
It sounds to me like there's a material way in which the Lacan that we have and grapple with today is not actually Lacan, but like some kind of homogeny of his listeners, something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think there are multiple Lacans, right? I think everyone, people in the same room would hear different Lacans, and he would constantly reinvent himself, and he would blow up associations that he founded, right? And he would, even as he would kind of occupy this position of the master, of the subject supposed to know, he would kind of just then frustrate that and play with it and sort of see how far people could go with like pretending that he was very much about like cultivating projections and deploying them in these ways, such that one thing I think that to turn that negative into a positive, I'd say is that even more so than like the way we said you can get to have your own Freud, you really can get to have your own Lacan. Like anyone who tells you that they've understood everything in the Lacanian opus and that they put it together in a systematic way, I mean,
they're lying to you or to themselves or both.
Yeah, the systematicity in Lacan consists of a deliberately anti-systematic approach. Like he continually undoes certain things and like you can get the gestures, and that's what we're going to go for. But like, it's not much as the guy practiced what he preached, or at least instantiated what he preached, insofar as that his legacy, as what Mikkel Borch-Jacobson has called the absolute master, is impossible to master for anybody, and that's kind of the point. Not that people can't spend their entire lives, either getting trapped in it or finding useful things in his work, but.
It's interesting because the three of us have talked a lot about the sort of, to the extent that a podcast has a mission, this one involves a certain amount of like demystification of taking things that are often, esoteric or gatekept. Is that a word? Gatekept?
Yeah,
is that the past tense of? Yeah, okay. And saying like, no, let's open up some access to these things without you having to spend all of your time doing it. Yeah. And yet, I would say that Lacan has been a significant influence for everybody in this room, probably in that sort of both despite and because of the amount of mystification and frustration that is involved. And that's why I wanted to ask, like, what was your actual encounter? Because I'll tell you mine. In college, I studied a lot of, I guess, what you might call French theory. And I had some very wise professors who were like, one in particular, who was like, we always give you the primary text. And in this case, it's just not worth it. Okay. Like if you go to grad school, like go ahead and study Lacan. But right now I just want you to get the key concepts, and they assigned us, some really good commentaries. And so it wasn't really until I got to graduate school where I took a whole class on Lacan my first year. And I was livid. I was so angry because I'd spent all of this time reading two figures that I went on to write a dissertation about, Luceria Gray and Julia Kristeva, both of whom are intimately involved with in various complex ways that we're not going to go into right now, with Lacanian psychoanalysis, both theoretically and institutionally. And then I was suddenly reading the seminars, and I was living in this literally 200 square foot studio apartment. And I remember having a copy of Écrit for the first time, and also a couple of copies of some of the seminars, and throwing the books across the room. And it was that same year when I was rereading Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and he has this line that I'm going to completely misquote, but it's something about how he spent all of this time reading Hegel, and he's come to realize that if he doesn't understand everything in Hegel, the fault lies not with him, but perhaps with Hegel.
Yeah.
And like, it's not exactly, I found that enormously comforting, and it's not exactly the same dynamic that we're seeing here, because as Patrick has pointed out already, I think Lacan knows what he is doing in terms of being frustrating. And there is something that is extraordinarily deliberate about the idea of frustrating your expectations, scrambling your attempts at intelligibility, right? I mean, yeah, I guess I'll stop there. But I will say that it was for me only when I started reading Bruce Fink's work on Lacan in the clinic that I started to really be like, oh, I need to pay attention to this. And that was the way that I kind of found my way back to reading some of these essays in a meaningful way.
I don't think I ever threw his books across the room. I use an e-reader, and that would be very expensive.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But I remember trying to read at the time. I was pronouncing it crits. I remember trying to read it and getting very frustrated and realizing that I need to learn how this guy speaks, and being delighted to find, you can go on YouTube and find lectures of his, filmed by the French government, broadcast on TV in like the 70s or something like that.
He had a TV show.
Yeah. And to be able to sit and like listen to him talk, for one thing, he speaks in riddles. This man speaks in riddles intentionally.
Yeah.
And that was when I kind of realized it's not about, I think I was used to consuming new ideas is like taking sips out of a cup of water or something like that. Very organized, very tidy. They start small, they build big. Lacan, you have to stick your head in the river and like learn to breathe under there, and then maybe you can start kind of getting at some of his stuff. So
once you are become water.
Yeah. So I dropped trying to read the primary stuff, and I've just been what's the one McDowell's?
Malcolm Bowie's.
Yeah, Malcolm Bowie's Introduction to Lacan was awesome.
It's really good.
It's wonderful. I think that is the single best one-volume introduction to Lacan's thought by I think he may have been knighted ultimately, or he had like an OBE or something. But this venerable British scholar who was a Proust scholar, and I think they've done some Montaigne too. But he was at Oxford, brilliant, lovely guy, and he has this book called Lacan. And it's out of print, but you can find copies of it somewhere. And my fantasy is that we have enough people asking for it that they bring out a second edition, because it really is a wonderful account of Lacan. That's, it's geared towards people who have some awareness of psychoanalysis and some interest in this thing that we might call critical theory or philosophy. It's not necessarily very clinical. Think is probably more for the clinical stuff in some ways, but it is the Bowie incredibly lucid. It's really clear. It's funny. He's a wonderful British stylist, and it's not funny in sort of like this, the way with Zizek can be funny with all these rapid references and maybe you don't get the joke, but you have to pretend you do. I really think the Bowie book is a great one, and I want to recommend that to everybody. The answer for me is I got into Lacan pretty early, spent most of college reading all the Lacan I could get my hands on. I print most of the seminars or whatever. And I had gotten hooked on the idea of, one, trying to understand everything Zizek was doing. Being like, okay, so I have to memorize everything that's happening in Lacan. I have to understand all the differences between like key phrases in Lacan. What is the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary? How does that relate to feminine jouissance? How does feminine jouissance relate to the fact that the woman doesn't exist and neither does the sexual relationship, etc.? And I really threw myself into it. But three things kind of helped me get out of that.
All right. Let's hear it.
One was the realization that I only had so much time, but also that I'd gotten hung up on the mistaken belief, and for this I blame my Catholicism and a certain type of scholastic education, that just because something was the most difficult of the possible things out there, that it had to thus be the most insightful, true, useful.
Profound.
Some old like Gnostic thinking. It's hidden wisdom, so it must be true for some reason. Yeah.
And I will say, if you want to go into Lacan like that, you can. There are like Easter eggs you can find throughout this text, right?
Yeah. Which is why we are doing Lacan after
Taylor Swift.
Of course. Yeah. Lacan definitely has his eras. But I got really, really hardcore into it, and I wound up. I actually got a grant to go to the Cause Freudienne in Paris, which is one of the institutions that sort of proclaims his legacy. Wound up reading one set of transcripts for one of the seminars that he gave that had yet to be translated, and taking a stab at translating it myself. And I wound up teaching it, and later on, and all this. But like, it became clear to me that like, just because something was really, really difficult doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a there when you get there, or rather that maybe the more important thing, and this is the second of the three things, is the process of getting through the stuff is going to give you the stuff or the attitude that you need, the orientation or a certain set of tools, which will be different than being like, oh, here is the truth at the end of this sentence, or here's like what unlocks it.
Yeah.
So that was related sort of the second thing I realized, which was that a lot of the ways that I had encountered Lacan, and I think a lot of the ways other people encounter Lacan, is through like Zizek talk, or you get little snippets of film theory where people are saying, well, of course the frame this, and of course the castration that, and like it became very clear that, well, two things, sort of subpoint two things of the second thing, right? One, those people didn't necessarily have the chops to do that. Like they hadn't actually necessarily read everything, or they assumed that they understood everything throughout the Lacanian corpus, when in fact they kind of hadn't, or in fact they were just reading one particular period.
Right.
And the second half of this second thing that sort of struck me is actually the realization, the mounting one. I don't think anyone will argue with this. It's that a lot of the different terms, concepts, models of development, philosophical axioms, whatever you want to talk about, like whatever you want to call it, the things that Lacan produces over the years, they're actually not meant to cohere together into a clear system, right? In some ways, it's much more about the movement between the things.
Energistic.
It's fundamentally dialectical. So it was this realization that they would be imposing a false holism on this text, right? Or on this corpus, rather, in the name of like, and giving it this one single name as metonymy, namely that Lacan, right? But look, there are many Lacans. The third thing, and I think this is sort of the last thing, it's that I realized after, and this is just a test of time, right? After all these years memorizing all this theory, all these different interpretations of different variations in Lacanian texts, that a lot of that didn't stick with me. I wouldn't remember it. I couldn't remember, and not to toot my own horn too much, right? But like a lot of the things that I think make Lacan hard for people, particularly reading them in English, right, are a little bit easier in French because like they pivot on rhymes and like we'll talk about that. Yeah. And like so that stuff was accessible to me, and it was also like it was in there. It was in like my brain stew, whatever you want to call it. And still, I was losing it, and I was realizing that. But what I was retaining were like certain types of gestures, right? Certain types of orientations to problems, a certain sort of drama of what happens to the person in Lacan's theory of development, or what happens to people in Lacanian psychotherapy. And as the technical dimensions of it kind of faded away with time, what I found myself returning to was a certain set of core concepts and things, and realizing that those things, if you let yourself not be too intimidated by the text, or rather if you let it, and I love the analogy you gave, Dan.
Me too.
If you let it kind of wash over you, like literally, if you read this, if you sit down to read this the way you would read a VCR manual or an introductory
VCR manual.
Yeah, I don't know. Like
I mean, Lacan died in 1981, so he would have had a
a Betamax manual. Like, look, the next time you're installing one of your fancy zip drives, you're going to want to. No, but like if you try to read it the way you might read, okay, like an IKEA diagrams or something, right?
Like, you know, there are no words in those, right?
Well, they have graphemes, they have signifiers, right? There's that little guy, and then there's little.
I can already tell this is going to be a 2-part episode.
Yeah, maybe it is. But like,
called it.
Yeah, but that, like, you could actually, if you let yourself just go through it, reading it the way you'd read poetry, right? Assuming you read poetry, you try to read poetry, or the way you'd read like something a little more arty. You're not necessarily trying to be like, how does this line of the wasteland relate to this line of the wasteland? Or like, E.E. Cummings, why is it so weird you spell this way in one sentence and not enough in another, like in a different way in the other, right? And if you just let it wash over you, things emerge. It precisely, and this is my way to tie a bow on it, the way in which his work is about creating a vibe or producing a feeling or producing a relationship towards your own desire to understand and what can be known, that very much produces these kind of uncanny things where you read some stuff, it doesn't make any sense, except one sentence hits you and you come back to it. Right. Or you read it again and a different sentence hits you. So stuff like gets processed by you.
Up. It's sort of, I'm like reading your hand gestures. It's the image I'm getting, kind of combining what you're doing with your hands and Dan's, you know, kind of upsetting but accurate drowning metaphor, but somehow you're still alive in it. You're just, I feel like, like you've just kind of like become with it, is like, what precipitates out. And it's like, you know, what comes up on the beach after, you know, it's been high tide and then like the tide recedes. And it's like these, you know, these sorts of like, I mean, I guess the word is rocks. So it's going to be like granules or nodules. We're really leaning into the free association here. But what we're going to try to do as we make our way through a bunch of episodes about Lacan this year is, you know, offer some of those little, like, I have this image of like iron pyrite, you know, like really bright kind of thing, like washed up on a beach, and just kind of like offer some of those. And it's not always going to be like, well, you can take this to the bank. But hopefully there will be some, as Patrick likes to say, cash value.
I wanted to call attention, Abby, because I think in a phrase that you used that really underscores your point, and it's a distinctively Lacanian phrase, it's the idea of something precipitating.
Yeah.
Right? And this is going to give an example, too, of how Lacan is all about puns and language. And whereas, you know, it's interesting because he'll call for this return to Freud, as Abby will describe, but also he's going to be using his reference that he keeps returning to are very different from what Freud does, right? So where Freud will talk about, biology and nerves, the things that are at hand for Lacan will be like the surrealists, linguistics, animal behavior, the beginnings of what we call ethology, etc. But the point in all this is that it throws so much at you, it overwhelms you. And in fact, even there's this wonderful line from Malcolm Bowie that sort of describes this.
Please.
Where Bowie writes, "One of Lacan's recurrent purposes as a writer is to amplify theories to the point where they become deranged, to supercharge them with meaning in such a way that they no longer have uses or applications. It is as if he is prepared to ask the question, how useful is all this, only when the theory in question has owned up to its madness." And I mean, later, I think there is a lot of stuff that's useful in Lacan. And actually, I will say, I think the work of my friend Kareem Malone, who's a psychologist who uses Lacan clinically, like there's stuff in Lacanian corpus that has tremendous uses clinically. It's just that he also has stuff that, and I think in a way that no other psychoanalyst since Freud has, is also useful for people who are interested in other disciplines, whether it be political science or film theory or any of numerous things. But I think the idea here, though, that we want to thematize is that if you're going into this looking for something very specific, you're probably not going to get it. And if you're going into it assuming you know what you're going to get the opposite, or you're going to wind up getting very frustrated. Instead, you kind of have to go into it and see what falls out or shakes out. And the phrase that Lacan uses, bear in mind, this full of the punning, the references, etc., is this idea of precipitate, right? And this is a word that in English and French has many of the same meanings, right? But a precipitate can mean first, like I could precipitate your going to the store by stealing all the toilet paper. It could just mean I caused something, right? You have none of this stuff, now you have to go out and get it. Precipitation can also be rain, right? Stuff that literally comes out of the sky. Precipitate can also mean, in the chemical sense, right, in the specific discipline of chemistry, it's when you get a whole bunch of things in, what do they call them, like a colloidal suspension, right? A bunch of things are put together in a mixture, you shake it up, and then some stuff falls out to the bottom.
Yeah, that's the image that I was trying to go for before.
That's the precipitate, right? And then the final sense of it consists of like using the word as an adjective, with precipitous haste, or the idea of speed and kind of like a decisive movement that produces something that may be disastrous, but in any event comes from the doing. And all these different senses, right? I think these ideas of these very overdetermined uses of this word, but also this entire idea of like a deliverable that's going to come from something, but you don't know what it is. And you're going to be anxious about it. You're going to feel weird about it and see what trickles out. That's, I think, the way to approach Lacan. And what I think we want to do in some of these episodes is to give people a chance to both approach Lacan in a way that's not intimidating, to develop their own Lacan, and to see what precipitates out in ways that actually can be very clarifying and useful. Because it's precisely by, well, we might say estranging, or he might say alienating, which is a very uniquely Lacanian way. Freud doesn't talk about things as being alienating. By alienating things that are given to us, stuff's going to shake out.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Danielle.
And today we are doing our first of a to be determined but non-trivial number of episodes on podcast favorite French psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan. Specifically, we are doing today the first of what's going to be, as we have decided in the last 20 minutes and as predicted by Dan.
A two-part episode.
As predicted by Dan, the second he saw the outline, a two-part episode on a 5-page essay, which is the mirror stage as formative of the I function as revealed in psychoanalytic experience, which is probably Lacan's most famous essay, I would say. And he delivered it in 1949 in Zurich at the 16th International Congress of Psychoanalysis. But because it is our first Lacan episode, while we're not going to give you like an entire episode's worth of biographical background, we do want to do some context and ground clearing. We'll talk a little bit about his biography, but I also want us, since we just did this whole sort of intro, which if you are already like a Lacanian or invested in the Lacanian project or one way or another, you may have been nodding your head and being like, yeah, sure, what precipitates out? But a lot of other people are like, wait, what? Why are we doing this? So
why is this episode so wet?
Why is it so moist in particular? We want to talk a little bit about his significance. Why are we spending so much time with this figure? Not only to look at some of the text and concepts that are most closely associated with him, that are his most important legacies, but to situate you, essentially. Before we even do the bio, I want to say one thing that I think if gun to my head, someone's like, what's the most important thing about Lacan? Not a situation I expect to be in.
Very strange hostage situation.
Okay, yeah. Look, in the business of philosophy, we do unusual thought experiments all the time. And this thought experiment is gun to your head. What do you tell people about Jacques Lacan? I would say this. He is important for a whole host of reasons, but for me, at least, and for many of, I think you could really say his followers. I mean, I think that's really the right word. And, we can, on another episode, talk about some of the kind of incredible sociological dimensions of the entire community that gathered around Lacan at what came to be the École Freudienne and his seminars. We're not going to do that right now. But it's something like Lacan is the single best and most influential reader of Freud that we have. You will often hear Lacan himself framing what he does as a return to Freud. And it's not just Freud, like tout court, it's particularly the early Freud. I would say, even to the extent that this podcast is influenced by Lacan, you can see it in the ways that we keep coming back to texts like the Studies on Hysteria, the Interpretation of Dreams, the 3 essays. That's Lacan's focus as well. We're getting that from him. But I really wanted to read you this sentence, and this is something that Lacan said in 1980. I'm taking it from Stuart Schneiderman, who is a Lacanian analyst turned life coach. No, really. His book, Jacques Lacan, The Death of an Intellectual Hero, which is really great. Throughout his life, even as there were Lacanians, Lacan was like, okay, well, that's not me. And he says, c'est à vous d'être Lacanien si vous voulez, moi, je suis Freudien. Okay, so like, you want to be Lacanians? Like, okay, go ahead. I'm a Freudian. Like, so he, and he dies the year after that. That's 1980. He dies in September 1981. So to the end of his life, he understood himself not necessarily as elaborating a new psychoanalysis, but as doing what I would call, in some ways, a fundamentally conservative task, which is the return to the origins of the movement. Like, that's something you actually will see in religious fundamentalist movements, is like, we got to go back to the beginning. And that is, even as Lacan has this reputation for being like radical and wacky and the short session and all, and, he's this sort of rebel who gets expelled from the International Psychoanalytic, he's the sort of like cowboy of psychoanalysis. That's all true. But there is also this thing that is, let's go back to the text, and let's go back in particular to this early set of texts.
Yeah, to underscore Abby's point, I think if you were to describe like Jacques Lacan's significance in like 2 or 3 sentences, you could say that he is arguably the most influential and controversial psychoanalytic thinker of the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah,
you could be a little cheeky and say he's the most influential successor to Freud, or you could say, but there you immediately get into sort of the meat of what Abby was getting at here, which is namely, what's the character of this return? And I think that the return to Freud, right? And clearly it's not the return to Freud in the way that, well, there's an old Borges story about a guy who sets out to rewrite the Quixote, but from scratch. And his whole idea is that his name is Pierre Menard, and he's going to rewrite Cervantes' Don Quixote, but he's going to do it without copying the book. He's just going to literally get himself into the headspace where he's going to write an identical volume to Don Quixote, and everyone will be like, wow, this is an amazing book by Pierre Menard. Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, Cervantes' Quixote. Yeah. It's clearly not that, right? Not least because Lacan is going to center disciplines or objects or concepts that were not very close to Freud. Like, for example, he's going to talk a lot about language and linguistics. Mm-hmm. He's also not very interested in like the literal, say, biological dimensions of the human body in some ways, or at least as far as like literal organs are concerned. So for example, when he talks about castration, he's going to be talking about it in a very different way than say Freud would be in the 3 Essays on Sexuality.
A different register.
A different register. That's one way of thinking. Yeah. But also too, he's going to, in his return to Freud, he's going to try to get us to encounter or to perform something that I hope on the podcast we've been centering as a very basic Freudian sort of habit. Namely, here's something that's given. Let's really sit with it for a little and see what it means and how it comes about and how our desires like for it to be something affect the stories we tell about how it came to be, right? It's very much a work of estrangement, of rendering uncanny. And also, to use another sort of word that's not a Freudian word, but that is a very Lacanian word, he's a theorist of alienation. And in all these ways, then, he allows us to return to some of the things that, were in Freud and that may have made Freud very controversial and such a, a master of suspicion or a Copernican thinker, right, in a revolutionary sense in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. But he does it in a way that's a little more legible for people who are in what you might call a postmodern era, right? And so in those ways, like it's a return with variation and it's a productive encounter. I think we could also say too that one thing that thinking about Lacan makes us do is re-encounter the way in which Freud comes to stand in for knowledge that we don't like, right? Or the idea of knowledge that's distressing, and then these ethical, moral considerations like, well, what's this guy's deal? What does he really believe? And how does what he believes relate to the moral valences of the discipline that he creates and the therapeutic practice he leaves us and the theoretical edifice he articulates, etc. Lacan is kind of a notorious asshole. And we're not going to get into some of the stories about like Lacan's personal life or even some of the stories, I later, maybe a wild analysis, I can tell some of the stories about things he said to people I knew. But he was not a paragon of virtue.
He wasn't a nice man.
He was not a nice guy. No, but in that way, again, it makes us think about like what are our expectations of people who have knowledge, right? Are they necessarily? In other words, it interjects us. It sticks us back into the fact that knowledge is never just an abstract thing; it's embodied in people, but also it's a thing we project onto people. And sometimes the people who are giving it to us, that knowledge may not be fully self-present to them, and sometimes their brilliance consists in their saying things that give us ourselves back to us, even though they themselves may be full of shit and partially it may be a bit of a, like a crook sometimes, or maybe they're inconsistent, but still through this sort of deliberative process of things hitting the real or precipitating out, meaning happens.
I guess this isn't about him as a person exactly, except insofar as like he writes like a dick, right? He writes like an asshole. Like all of these things are, but like, full disclosure, I wouldn't do this anymore, but I did write a chapter of a dissertation that was entitled In Praise of Unintelligibility. I was really into like books that deliberately frustrate you. And I was writing about Lucy Gray, who Lacan famously kind of screwed over professionally, and also Lacan. But like, I like that kind of writing. I do. But there are ways that you can do it that bring people in, and then there are ways that you can do it that do not. And also some of Lacan's most famous clinical interventions, like the idea of the short session, which has, it's interesting, right, in terms of like the idea that if you're in a 50-minute hour, not consciously, but you're probably going to save almost all of the best stuff for like the minutes 48, 49, and 50. And so, Lacan was attempting to intervene in that, or at least that's the theory, by saying like, well, this could end at any time. It's, it's a direct, it's an attempt to sort of short circuit some of the defenses of the ego and to get at the unconscious in some more direct ways. But I think it's helpful to contrast that to this sort of extreme focus on kindness and like holding and containing of someone like Winnicott, even somebody who is, as we talked about in our conversation a few weeks ago with Brian Go-Smith, is a theorist of hate, but is nonetheless, even in his writing, he's an analyst who is so kind. His concepts, I don't know a single mother who has interacted with the idea of Winnicott's good enough mother who hasn't, slept better some nights because of that. This is not the character of the kind of intervention that Lacanian ideas prompt. And so we're not doing like a particular ad hominem on Lacan as a person, although there are like, again, tons and tons of stories about his, I'll just say unkindness, but it's jarring, and it's jarring on purpose.
Yeah. The example of the short session is a perfect one, right? Just because, again, it's in the modern moment, we're like, wow, imagine if you pay for 50 minutes and you're talking 10 minutes in and your clinician is like, I don't think you're going to produce any good material today. Or like,
we're done now.
We're done now. Or like basically, or it just says,
I'm done with you.
I'm done with you. Right. And you're like, God damn it, I want to talk about my abandonment issues some more. And like, no. And then they
come back tomorrow.
Yeah. And like, you could be like, oh my God, this person is now going to double bill and see 3 people, in the 50 minutes. You could be like, why the fuck would they do that? But you don't feel, it puts you in a relationship of antagonism, or what you might even call paranoia. Right, which is a nice thing. Unsurprisingly, Lacan theorizes as a theorist of knowledge as paranoia, but also it kind of speaks to something. I'm not necessarily defending the short session. I know people who love it. I know people who hate it. I don't think it would be good for me.
It is the thing that got him expelled from the International Psychoanalytic.
Yeah, it's a deliberately prickish kind of performance, right? It's a deliberately. Here's what I'll say about it. More than anything else, it's a radical and strange thing to do. And he also,
it's genius, right?
And authorized too by this logic of the precipitate.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the idea here is like, we are going to by making analysis instead of a tired, familiar 50-minute hour, and introducing a kind of precipitate haste to it. It could end at any moment.
Mhm.
Stuff shakes out, i.e. precipitates, that sticks with you after the session, right? It actually shakes you up. You could see how, and to us now, that's like, well, that goes against a more like caring type of containing therapy, right?
Yeah.
And it could even go against Winnicott in his era, right? And Winnicott, by the way, you cited Lacan, though his vision, his vision of the mirror stage is quite different. As is, and this is another reason why I think we're going to be reading Lacan and why Lacan is relevant for us. Tons of people cite Lacan, like from Winnicott to Fanon, right? To Kristeva and Eric Ryan, all these other figures, right? But at the time Lacan was writing, his interventions were also very much about contending with and unseating what he saw as schools of thought and practices of therapy that had de-radicalized Freud, right?
Yeah,
and
hence the need for the return
exactly
to the radicality.
And so
Freud.
they may not have been, say, giving us like the repeated familiar, you get so comfortable you no longer feel any stakes to it 50-minute hour with someone who basically says, and how do you feel? And like, I hope you have a good weekend, right? It's not the same thing for him then, but his targets, namely the Kleinians and ego psychologists, both of whom we'll talk about later in the context of this essay, he sees them as having produced practices and theories that are equally just formal, that are equally about vindicating a theory over and against certain other sort of like claims of illness, of suffering, of transformation, whatever. But the idea there is through things like through the short session or through things like making you talk about lack so much, he is going to return you to what he sees as being radical. The character of the return to Freud is simultaneously a polemical claim against contemporary visions of what therapy should be or could be or could only be. And it's also an attempt to return to what made the beginning enterprise of therapy with Freud so important to begin with.
As somebody that's been reading around Lacan for the last couple of years, and I feel like I'm at the stage of I'm beginning to understand the things that I don't understand. Like not understand the things, but I kind of am able to see what I don't know in Lacan. So I'm really excited about the series. So anybody out there that's listening that is a little lost right now, I'm right there with you. So far we know Lacan kind of a prick. I wanted to see if I can encapsulate, Patrick, what you were getting at with the vibes. It's less important what the dots are. It's more important how he draws the line to connect them. That's kind of what you were getting at there.
Yeah, I think that's what you just said there very brilliantly might be another one sentence way to describe Lacan.
In terms of like the oracular.
In terms of the oracular stuff, like he's going to make us, what he wants to do is he wants to make us feel about language and about Lacan talking specifically, but also all speech that happens in therapy or the strange phrases that we hear as a child. He wants us to feel as weird about that as we do about a dream when we wake up about it, right? It's that type of unsettling thing. But the other thing is, yes, there are certain key specific Lacanian concepts and terms, right? Today we're going to do the mirror stage. The other one's going to be the gaze.
Today
right?
and in 2 weeks.
Yeah. So yes, there are certain key concepts, but also Lacan is very much a thinker of patterns and above all of structures. So one thing Lacan is going to do in a way that's a little bit different from Freud, though he's authorized by Freud to do it, is to talk about a lot of things in terms of relational dynamics, or to use another word, dialectics, right? I.e., the father isn't just literally the guy who comes home from work. The father is who has to have a particular set of genitals and et cetera, right? Rather, the father is a position that has a function in a family system. Right? Yeah. He's going to move towards describing things in terms of functions, relationships, and structures. And learning to perceive those structures, those patterns, and those relationships is in some ways much more important than the fine distinctions of what is in each and every position in those structures and patterns.
So even though I feel like this is like very us to be like, well, it's, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes into this episode, we're finally going to tell you a few biographical details of the person we have just been discussing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it actually speaks to the fact that both you and I, Patrick, like dislike systematicity in a certain way, that we vibe with Lacan in different but not unrelated ways. But I'm going to suggest that against all inclination, we take our head out of the like Lacanian river or I don't know, whatever body of water it was that Dan, we take a breath, we return to the air, and we say a few words about Lacan's biography and a little bit about his philosophical legacy.
Yeah. So this is going to take 2 minutes because I would like us to talk about Elizabeth Roudinesco's biography at some other point.
Yeah.
But again, this is just a teaser.
Which is enormous.
Right?
So, yeah.
So, he's born to a Parisian family in 1901. They're fairly well-to-do. A kind of interesting data point here is that his brother, I believe his younger brother, goes on to become a monk. Yeah. And so there's this relationship to Catholicism in the family that's kind of interesting. Lacan himself will continue, and this is probably part of the reason why, again, like calling back to why I was into him, because he's very much like a hermeneutic, kind of like get into these books and these weird bits of Latin and all these different things, right? But that like he's not a believing Catholic for sure. And actually, Abby, onto the point of like him being a huge prick, my single favorite line in Lacan, which I think maybe some people will laugh on this, and maybe, but also there's some element of like national humor.
You can never know what how the other's going to respond.
But Lacan's the type of guy who at some point will be, I forget which seminar it is, but then he mentions he's talking about Christian themes, whatever, but it's all kind of implicit. And in some ways, like, well, now I suppose we must finally turn to Jesus Christ, since he is, after all, a fairly significant figure. the chutzpah of like, yeah, oh yeah, this Christ guy, right? It's kind of amazing. I mean, you're like attributing to Lacan messianic Christ-like delusions to himself at that point seems almost insufficient, right? But so yeah,
well, he's the second coming of Freud.
Yeah, he's the second coming of Freud. Look, he studies. What makes Lacan interesting, right? He goes into medical school and studies. In his first case, which we'll talk about some other time, he actually doesn't have that many case histories that we have that much access to. But his early stuff is very much interested. His early thesis, etc. He's very interested in like family systems and the family complex, which is a lovely little essay that's actually not very hard. I recommend to people. But also, his thesis is very much about it's on psychosis and a criminally insane woman, right? And without saying too much, we'll just say that he begins to structuralize paranoia. He starts thinking about paranoia not just as a condition, even as he deals with it specifically, but also is very interested in ideas of like anxiety versus the other. But the idea of psychosis and its relationship to language was very important to him.
Yeah. The
only other really important thing to know about Lacan, and I'm going to really do want to keep this short, is that he is in the first half of the 20th century, right? He has his thesis in 1932. He's really jacked in with some very interesting folks in the broader art world, right? In
like
the intellectual
surrealists,
yeah. Like you can find coffee with Salvador Dali. Hell, I think actually during the war, I think he treats Anton Artaud, who he says is incurable. Maybe right. He gets, if you're into phenomenology, he does lectures with his fellow Binswanger. He goes to Zurich and meets Jung. He trains.
Did he meet Jung?
Yeah, he met Jung briefly.
Oh, okay.
Though he never met Freud, which is really really interesting. In 1939, when Marie Bonaparte, the princess and Freud's sort of like patron and patient, finally helps Freud and his family leave Vienna, she throws a big party for him in Paris, and Lacan is invited but does not go. Right. So
meet your heroes.
We must return to the master, but I myself will never meet him.
I mean, wisdom, honestly.
Yeah, don't meet your heroes. He marries in 1934 and has 3 kids with a woman named Marie-Louise Blondin. In that same year, he joins the French Psychoanalytic Association, or the Association in Paris. He's also kind of interestingly in circles, not just with like phenomenologists, like he attends lectures given by Merleau-Ponty, but also with all these people that are associated with what's sometimes called like, well, they're kind of neo-Hegelians.
Well, he goes to Kojève's lectures,
he goes to
right?
Kojève's
Which is really important, and which, if there's like, if you want to pick like one event in that part in terms of like intellectual history for, this sort of strand of thought, like going to Kojève's lectures on Hegel is one of them. And, at some point we will talk about the Hegelian dimensions of Lacan's thought.
In one sentence, if we wanted to like describe what that sort of does for him, but also what Kojève sort of represents, it's that the phases of Hegel's dialectic, his grand story of Geist progressing through different forms across different historical eras, Kojève really amps up the agonistic, competitive, aggressive dimensions of the dialectic, right? He's very famous for his reading of the master-slave dynamic. There's mutual interdependence, but also it's always sort of thanatotelic. It sort of tends towards death.
We'll drop it in the show notes. It's still one of the single best commentaries on the phenomenology of spirit.
It's amazing. So he hangs out with people like André Breton and Salvador Dali, and he attends lectures with Kojève. He gets very much involved with Bataille. George Bataille, who's another major thinker, kind of close to my heart. We can't really talk about too much here, but he does ultimately have an affair with Bataille's wife, Sylvie, whom he marries.
Honestly, like really living dangerously when you consider Bataille's interest in human sacrifice.
Yeah, they were all. Yeah, supposedly they all wanted to do it. Everyone at the Ancephal group, which is what they called it, the Acephal group, the headless group. They wanted to do a human sacrifice, but the thing was that everyone wanted to be the
sacrifice.
Yeah, everyone wanted
no one
wanted
to be the. Yeah,
it's like they're doing weird sex sacrifice stuff.
Well, they're talking about it.
Yeah.
I know we're in the realm of Lacan here, where everything is language, but if no one actually got sacrificed, like that's.
It is interesting how much better Lacan trucks with the art community, and how Freud seemed to kind of avoid. Didn't he look down on a lot of the arts folks that were inspired by him? And Lacan went the complete other direction.
Lacan is a Parisian.
Yeah.
Like, I encourage people to Google the photo of young Lacan smoking. Like, he is a hot, louche guy who sits in the Café du Magot smoking cigarettes.
Louche, anyway.
Definitely. No, that picture is smoking.
You think?
He's an attractive guy. I think he was an attractive guy when he was older.
Have you seen him
I feel like this is Travis Kelce all over again.
Lacan could go topless and look great. Did we not see the photos of him on that bench smoking? He looks wonderful.
Maybe we'll add that to the show notes too.
I mean,
he's like a heroin chic young Stalin. I'm just going to move right on.
Yes, he's much more tapped into the art world than, Freud in some ways famously middlebrow taste in literature and culture, or like in contemporary literature anyway.
And is very much interested in, and Freud's very much hung up on science above all else, right?
Well, he's bourgeois. He's Victorian. He's bourgeois. We're talking about he's Vienna. Lacan is Paris. Like it's a whole. I realize I'm painting with a very broad brush, but
very different traditions.
Very different traditions. So we're gonna stop there with the bio, because we are gonna talk more about the sort of group and movement that formed around Lacan, but. Right now, we're going to finally get into talking about this essay, The Mirror Stage. And it is really an early essay by Lacan. And it's him taking a step onto the international stage in terms of the international psychoanalytic community. So we're going to bracket for a moment the École Freudienne and all the sort of like later like apparatus of like Lacanianism and get into it. I want to say really quickly before we do that, I want to call back to something that you said a little while ago, Patrick, that I think is really astute, where you're talking about it's not quite that you're saying that Freud is literal and Lacan is metaphorical, right? That's not right. That's reductive. But there is a way in which you can read Lacan as taking so much of what Freud is thinking about in some very concrete terms, and thinking about them in terms of structure and in terms of function. And I do think it's that kind of abstraction as like, he's a man who thinks in terms of abstraction overall. I think it's not surprising that he has also been deeply influential in a number of strands of philosophy. I'm not particularly interested in gatekeeping the concept of like who counts as a philosopher, but I will say that when I was rereading Malcolm Bowie in preparation for today, there is this line where he says something to the effect of like, it's not surprising if you think that this paper, the Mirror Stage, is kind of strange as like as a intervention into a psychoanalysis, because it seems more like an intervention in like a conversation about like ontology or metaphysics. And I think that most American listeners who have run into Lacan have probably done so via Zizek.
I think,
but
there are lots of reasons why thinkers like Zizek like Lacan, and there's a lot of reasons why thinkers in the humanities like Lacan. Not least of which that he's actually engaging with all sorts of different disciplines and things. He's talking about language. His tastes aren't those of the rather middlebrow Freud, right? He'll interface with texts that he has an entire seminar about James Joyce, right? Whereas Freud seems to have been unaware of the existence of Joyce, or at least did not I can't find very much on that, right? So that's all there, right? He's already in this humanities space that's accessible, or at least has certain shared things with other thinkers. The other thing, though, about Lacan is that this is very different from Freud insofar as that as a genre, Lacan has papers, yes, but they're not like some of the papers we've already read in the standard edition, or even the letters we've read in the standard edition. They cross genres. They involve these strange, he almost starts as though he'll use we, or he'll reference things that the audience doesn't necessarily, he'll presuppose an audience, or he'll suggest an audience, which may not be the actual audience reading it. Sometimes they're like manifestos. Other times they're like meditations. And other times they seem like they're polemics. And other times they seem very clinical. But it's all these things sort of at once. And that is, I think, perfectly highlighted in the text that we have before us today.
All right, you ready to get into it?
It's Lacan time, baby.
All right, we're going to do it.
Let's do it.
We could talk a lot about background for this paper specifically. Let's just say two things. One, the translation that we're using is the more recent translation.
Yeah.
That's by Bruce Fink. So if you've got the older one, it's Kahn's translation, that will not be quite as helpful as this one if you want to follow along.
Yeah, we're Bruce Fink fans on this show, both of this translation and also of many of his books. Very, very helpful in getting to understand Lacan.
Two, in terms of background for this paper, it's important to point out that this was given in basically two versions. Mm-hmm. One in 1936 at the International Psychoanalytic Association conference, I think in Marienbad.
Yes, it was in Marienbad.
And, we can talk more about what was going on in the IPA and the reaction to it, but we're going to set that entirely aside till a future episode where we get more in depth into Lacan and psychoanalysis in France and the international psychoanalytic sort of history.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say that after the war, in 1949, he gives a revised version of this paper in Zurich at the 16th International Congress of Psychoanalysts.
Which is what we are reading today.
Yes. And where I'd like us to start, actually, is to do something that I think is a good exercise for any psychoanalytic paper, but look at the title of this specifically.
Absolutely.
What's the title in English?
In English, it is The Mirror Stage as Formative of the I Function as Revealed in Psychoanalytic Experience.
Do we kind of notice anything about this title right from the get-go? Does anything kind of leap out to us?
It feels like mathy to me. Formative function, like every word stacking on top of every other. It feels intentional.
And even I in the Fink is italicized. So yes. It looks like a variable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that stands out here is just the concept of the I as a function built into the title.
So this is already something to point to here, right? If you look at like books of Freud's that are translated, or articles of Freud's that are translated, oftentimes they have titles like the ego and the id, mourning and melancholia. In other words, processes or disorders and psychic agencies, like entities that are kind of, to use a fancy word, reified, which is to say thingified. They have a certain substantial character. Mm-hmm. Here, what Lacan is highlighting is a functional character, right? Which suggests, one, this language of mathematics, and he definitely is going to play a lot with math, like sort of metaphors here, but it also suggests the way in which whatever this thing is that we call an I is not a given static entity, but is rather something that is dynamically produced and presumably has to be produced in an ongoing kind of way. It's also key to point to the fact that second half of the title, as revealed in psychoanalytic experience. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Are we doing like a new criticism thing where I can only look at the title, or can I relate it to the rest of the text, or no? Your call. You're running
the title first. Yeah, do it for the title first.
Oh, okay. It sounds like it's going to be pretty clinical. That's what I would say. And maybe I'm a little bit cheating here because it's not especially clinical is what I kind of want to point out. But yeah, it seems like, and I'm especially thinking about a remark that Jonathan Lear makes about Freud in his really excellent Intro to Freud, which is just called Freud, where he's making a case that you should really read the clinical material, and you can kind of like let the later putting psychoanalysis on a couch stuff, go. We obviously don't necessarily agree with that. It's not the position of this podcast, but there is this line from Jonathan Lear where he's like, Freud was listening to people in pain, and psychoanalysis emerged from that. And that's actually true when you read the Freudian corpus. And I think the thing that's interesting here is it seems like we are going to get into something that is about Lacan's clinical experience. And spoiler, it is not.
Yeah, we're only going to get a couple allusions to it in this paper. And I think this is also helpful for us to engage a moment in a callback to, like, remember we sort of divided like psychoanalytic thought more broadly and sort of Freud's writings in terms of genre as kind of encompassing or spanning like what we called three baskets, right? The baskets of the clinical stuff, namely what happens in therapy, how do you do therapy, what's like this case study, what's good technique. Then there's what we call metapsychological, which is like, well, what are these psychic agencies? Do we want to think about them as an ego, superego, id? Do we want to talk about them as functions or structures, whatever? Essentially, it's working from the clinical data to arrive at models of mind, and of course, going back and forth between those. Yes. And then the third one is sort of like the applied psychoanalysis bucket. And that allows us to draw in either to use psychoanalytic concepts to talk about literary texts or history in a sort of one-to-one way, or to kind of use them as analogies or metaphors, or in any event to tie together these complicated ways in which psychoanalysis is like a universal science of the radically particular singular individual. Right? It's paradoxical, but that's what's going on here. Now, Lacan, in this title, as it's presented at least in English, seems to be suggesting, one, we're going to talk about this thing called the I as a function, as having a formative, that is creative, or at least a shape-influencing role, and as being revealed in what he describes as a psychoanalytic experience. Those latter two words, right? It's not in clinical sessions,
right,
or in our experience as clinical psychoanalysts. It's instead the psychoanalytic experience.
Yeah. I think that's I'm just nodding enthusiastically at you, because I think there's a sort of expansion of what that category even means that's at work here.
Yeah, and he seems to be, in some ways, it's one aspect of it, and it's worth saying here for those of you who are interested in such things, that Lacan has a lot of quote unquote phenomenological aspects, right? And phenomenology is broadly speaking, if we want to name it in this terms that are most relevant here, it's a school of thought associated with 20th century French and largely Austrian, German writers, philosophers who are talking about the ways in which things appear. It's an attempt to
Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to basically, you bracket questions about what is or isn't existence, right? You bracket ontology. We're not going to talk about like essences or Plato's chairs, right? We're going to do what Husserl calls a bracketing exercise. And instead, we're going to develop a very exquisite vocabulary for describing how things come to us in perception, and try and find some vocabulary for describing the operations of perceptions across persons.
Yes, right? That's what I was going to say, but not in a sort of just purely idiosyncratic way, in search of like universal structures.
Exactly.
Which is like, I don't know that I feel like the entire episode has been like, we're going to talk about this, but not yet. We're doing this whole like revealing, concealing sort of thing. But there is this part of that where something we might talk about at some point is the scholarly discussion, which you, listener, may find fascinating or incredibly boring. That's up to you, about whether or not Lacan is a structuralist or a post-structuralist. But the ways in which there is this sort of interest in universal features of human consciousness, I would think would argue towards the structuralist argument.
And we should say, too, that the notion of doing phenomenological thinking, namely kind of like looking at things at really intensely bringing to bear experience and trying to pare away unnecessary aspects or like distracting aspects, right? As like not just like a meditative exercise, but like a meditative philosophical exercise is a venerable one.
Oh yeah, I mean Husserl's one of his most important books is called The Cartesian Meditations.
Exactly.
Right?
And some of us may remember, if you've read Descartes, the scene where Descartes gets a ball of wax from a candle, and it's like, how does this feel? How does this melt? How do I know what this is? Right? And then he starts asking questions like, how do I know when the candle just becomes? When does the candle stop being a candle? When does it become like a puddle of sticky stuff? Right? It's phenomenology. It's an orientation towards perception.
Where my students get really irritated.
Yeah, they hate that shit.
Throw the book across the room. An emerging theme today.
Yeah, like you with Lacan.
But in any event, right? This idea of the psychoanalytic experience here is not necessarily the clinical experience. It's about like a psychoanalytic orientation to thinking about experience. And the people that he positions as an audience are people who are psychoanalysts, but who are not just thinking about clinical things or even metapsychological things, but are also sort of thinking in this certain philosophical term that might be a little alien to Freud.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, look, you might think that we're making too much of this seemingly simple term, psychoanalytic experience. And maybe we are. That's possible. I'll entertain it. This essay, as we will talk about at some length, and as is already evident in the title that Patrick is like very deliberately having us slow down with, it's about subject formation.
Yes.
So if you want to think about one way to understand the sort of like resituating of what is proper to this idea of psychoanalytic experience, you might think that for Lacan, we are in the realm of psychoanalysis whenever we are talking about the formation of the self. And that is, in so many ways, what this essay is about. It is about the formation of the self. It is about the formation of the self as always already other to itself, even at the moment when it perceives itself to be whole.
And we should say here too, note that this way of thinking is different from the Freudian one. We've already used this term subject, right? And subject can mean a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's at stake here is much more difficult because one, he's talking about like the subject, yes, as like the subject of experience, but also the subject as in like the person as a arena of speculation or a participant in psychoanalytic therapy, but also the subject is like it's the subject of language, the subject of the social order and ideological order, which is later where people go with this. But the idea here ultimately is how the subject isn't given, the subject functionally.
Right.
So the second thing I kind of want to say here too, and this is warranted vis-a-vis the title, as you'll see in a second, but also is a very helpful way for us to think about reading Lacan specifically, but also any psychoanalyst in terms of their communications to the public or to their colleagues, you know, in addresses and papers and case conferences, whatever, which is to ask the question, how does this constitute an audience, right? Its audience. Who is it addressed to? Who is it speaking from? I.e., it's not just a paper by Lacan. Lacan is going to put himself as representing something, and he's going to put his audience as representing something. More specifically, remember, there was an audience in 1939 at this paper, or 1936, and now in 1949, it's a different audience.
Yep.
But also there's this broader audience or this collectivity of the people who are interested in experience or the people who are experiencing psychoanalysis who want to think in these terms. And at that point, we should look at the title in its original French, because I think that also kind of points to something. So the title is Le stade du miroir comme formateur de la fonction du jeu, telle qu'elle nous est révélée dans l'expérience psychanalytique.
It's beautiful, for one.
Why, thank you.
Well, it's just because it's French.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah, Abby, does anything catch you interested in that title? I mean, again, you don't need to know Lacan to read French. Or rather, you don't need to know French to read Lacan. But I will say that for those of you who
it doesn't hurt.
It doesn't hurt. And also because a lot of what goes on in Lacan, he's so interested in language and fronts the question of language, punning, and the multiple senses of words is very much part of what's going on.
Yeah.
And
I mean, in French, pun is jeu de mots, like literally like play on words. And so again, not trying to be gatekeepy at all with respect to it, but it's more that so many of the things that Patrick was talking about is like precipitating out, do so out of specific puns often that are homophones in French. So we're going to bring those up when that is the case. I
think part of what's deliberately applying what Lacan is doing is this idea that stuff is overdetermined. There are too many meanings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that's what I would say is the way that I hear what you're doing here is in some ways like we're overcorrecting for the difficulty of Lacan. And that's a deliberate choice. But I think the point, if I'm hearing you correctly, that you're making, Patrick, is that can be generative in a certain way, especially in a tradition that values wordplay and free association. And that understand some of those things as fundamentally idiosyncratic. I also wanted to say, I actually did have to make my own translation of this essay when I was in graduate school, which was much, much worse than Bruce Fink's. Much, much worse. But I found it, and I will say this as somebody, like my French is fine, Patrick's French is much better than mine, but I did for several semesters this like philosophical text and translation workshop, which was probably the best thing that I did in graduate school. And, you know, one time we had to translate, and I'm bringing this up not because like my pathetic history of translating is especially interesting, but because two of these things we're going to talk about the second that we get into paragraph 1 of this essay, where Lacan is going to set up what he's doing in opposition to Descartes. I had to spend a whole semester translating Descartes' discourse on the method. And then I, at some point, translated this essay. And I learned that Descartes' French was much like kind of messier than I expected from the English translation. I mean, it's beautiful, but you expect it to be sort of like more declarative, like more like Hemingway-y than it actually is. And then reading and translating this, I remember feeling like, oh, some of this is actually much clearer. Yeah. And again, not because I have such beautiful French, I truly do not, but simply because there are some phrases that, like there's a part where he talks about the corps morcelé, like the kind of body in pieces, the fragmented body. And, in some ways it's a lot easier to think about that. That's pretty concrete as opposed to just like the sort of abstract idea of fragmentation.
So with all that in mind, right, we have the English title, The Mirror Stage is Formative of the I function as revealed in psychoanalytic experience. Right. And then we have the French title, Le stade du miroir comme formateur de la fonction du jeu, telle qu'elle est nous est révélée dans l'expérience psychanalytique.
Okay, so there's a lot there. I think it's significant that je is capitalized, which is I, which would normally not be capitalized. I should say that this whole title is not in caps, right? The way that it would be in an English essay. So it's distinctive. So the I that Bruce Fink is translating as like in italics is here capitalized, right? There's something that is strange or distinctive or idiosyncratic going on with how Lacan is using je, okay? And the other thing I want to point out is, I think our first play on words is Le stade du miroir. We generally translate this essay as just the mirror stage. Like that's what people say. It's like, oh, Lacan's mirror stage. And people are like, oh, okay, that's kind of like
it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. But stade is also stadium, and that's going to be important later on. I don't know. I mean, or arena. Yeah. Right. Like, so let's just hold that in your
that is useful
mind.
Yeah. Also, already the other is introduced it.
Yeah. There's so much. Yeah, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a second. When we get to sort of the drama. Yeah. But yeah, stage has. In English, captures maybe 3 of the 5 different possible meanings that are in the French.
Nice.
The other thing that's happening in the French too, which I think is so interesting and bears on that question of like, well, who is Lacan writing for? And also, what's the nature of Lacan's gestures, right? Is this tel qu'elle nous est révélée dans l'expérience psychanalytique, right? It's not as revealed in the psychoanalytic experience.
Right.
It's insofar as, or as it is revealed to us in the psychoanalytic experience.
Yeah, so us is obscured in the translation.
So already there's like he's speaking in a collective way. And he's speaking on, we could be like, well, one, he's speaking on behalf not just of clinical psychoanalysts, but people who are in any way involved with psychoanalytic experience. But also, too, and this is a classic Lacanian kind of gambit, and it's classically Freudian, too, in some ways, is he does a lot of gestures that are like, as we all remember, as we may agree, as we've all perfectly understood.
Yep.
And these gestures are, they're cheeky, right? On the one hand, you're like, oh, we all understand all this, right? So we're all together, and you sort of identify with him. But also, if you,
it's like you saying right.
Yeah, I don't mean to do that. People, when I'm saying right, I'm like, am I making sense?
Remember when my mom was like, Patrick should stop saying right because I don't always agree with it. Right. It's exactly that sort of gesture. It's like, as we all know, and like you take out your pen and you're like, do we though? Do we all know? Do we all agree?
What's a little bit different here with Lacan, right? Is for me, this is an insecurity gesture. Being like, am I being clear?
Well,
right?
For Lacan, it's a grandiose gesture.
For Lacan, it's a grandiose gesture that also could be, and this is a key thing, it puts you in a position of, even as it articulates a we all understand these things. I can guarantee you there are lots of people in the audience that are like, I wasn't there in 36, or like, I don't, what are you talking about? Right? Freud has a beginning of these, one of his most famous books, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, begins with a sentence that basically does the same thing. Abby, you got it memorized, lay it on us.
Well, yeah. Well, now that you said it, in the theory of psychoanalysis, we have no hesitation in assuming that the course of mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. Patrick knows that I know that because I took an entire class once where we just read that sentence. We could talk about that for a long time. I certainly did for a semester. But that sort of, we have no hesitation. It's a moment of, one, interpolating you into the we, and two, insofar as mentioning that we have no hesitation, introducing the very idea of hesitating. Yep. And that, therefore, some of those we's might be caught in the act of hesitation, right? So so it's interesting. It interpolates you all of these sort of like, of course, as we know, or we were here, and it's like, was it 13 years ago? Like, of course, that's not the case. So it both introduces and consolidates this we, but also gives you a moment of I think creating emotionally like, I'm not on board with this guy.
Yeah. It produces a kind of tension insofar as it presents what seems to be collective knowledge, and you're all supposed to nod with it. But also maybe you're like, I don't understand what this guy is talking about, but I should better keep nodding. And also there's the element of like, is this really total knowledge? Do we all understand this? Or is this guy just assuming that we understand it, or pretending that we understand it, or demanding that we ask him like,
or does everyone else but me understand it?
Exactly. In other words,
can I say also,
paranoia,
it's an experience of paranoia.
Yes.
Yeah, it's created that experience of paranoia from the very beginning. Can I say though, this is in the spirit of the like, it's not you, it's Lacan, that if you get into reading intellectual history about like the Lacanian circle and about this time, you will find all of these eminent scholars who went year after year to Lacan seminars, and then like decades later will be like, I had no fucking clue what this guy was talking about.
And I'll just I'll let this out, right? One of my dear dissertation mentors was a very close personal friend of Lacan, and would spend a lot of time in the 70s in Paris while she was writing her own work, and attended a couple of his lectures, but more would just go to dinner with Lacan after the lectures. And the story is, that she tells, is that he would recurrently, when she was at the lectures, occasionally, she was very clear, I was not a Lacan student, would say, so Shoshana, what did I say? Because I don't remember. Again, like, and who knows? Is this playful? Was he literally in a fugue state? Was he just sort of free associating?
Is he testing her?
Yeah. But again, it's like this idea of, if there's one thing Lacan does, and this is why later he'll be so interested in people like James Joyce and Thomas Aquinas, is he produces enormous amounts of language that are almost sagging under the weight of overdetermination. And rather than getting caught in like the trying to reconcile all of it or to perceive inner logics that sort of like traverse the whole thing, we can instead dive in and out because there's already going to be so much for us to get out of it.
Yeah. Right? I thought you were going to see he just keeps going. The images I have is like Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah, no, he basically does. I mean, like part of his early work is on language and psychosis. And one of the ways he basically argues some people can deal with difficulties in experience is through basically becoming creatures of language. And they become graphomaniacs. They become constant talkers. And for him, well, James Joyce is one of those. We could argue with Lacan himself is. But in any event.
Derrida is totally one of them.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Apparently he used to like write at stop sign like while he was driving. Like
probably also the key to Substack. But that's another point.
Stephen King.
Yeah, Stephen King, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. But here, just to put a fine point on this then, we've already gotten these ideas. This object of the discussion is a function, not a given entity.
Right.
The field in which that function is being revealed phenomenologically is not necessarily the clinical consulting room, but bears some relation to a broader psychoanalytic experience that may include the consulting room, but also includes other disciplinary ways of thinking about phenomena. And three, we are in a position now of kind of difficult or anxious knowledge vis-a-vis our collective participation as an audience in relation to Lacan, the person telling us all this.
Right.
So that's all what I wanted to hit, and then we can dive right now into the first graph.
Okay. And so diving into the first graph, he starts out by saying basically, I already introduced this conception 13 years ago, and it's been accepted, but I'm going to revisit it, especially because it brings to light certain aspects of this I function. So before we can get into what that I function is, I want to read the final line of the first paragraph and spend a little bit of time unpacking what it is that Lacan is setting himself up against. Okay. He says, it should be noted that we are going to stop reading everything in both French and English at this point. Okay, we're just going to go to English. It should be noted that this experience, the experience that psychoanalysis gives us of the I function, it should be noted that this experience sets us at odds with any philosophy directly stemming from the Cogito. All right, so the Cogito is a reference to René Descartes. If you know one thing about Descartes, it is, right, I think, therefore I am, although if you do read, that's the Latin version. If you read the French version in the Discourse on the Method, it's je pense donc je suis. So more accurately, I am thinking, I mean, it goes both ways, but the present progressive is pretty important here. I am thinking, therefore I exist, or therefore I am existing. We could, but I promise will not do too much on Descartes here. The purpose of bringing this up and unpacking it a little bit is to say that what Lacan is up to with this notion of the I as a function is diametrically opposed to the idea that the I is a thing of which one can possess total, transparent self-certainty. Okay, so very, very quick philosophical sidebar. Descartes, in his stove-warmed room, radically and systematically doubts everything. You know, he doubts his perception, he doubts whether or not he's dreaming, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, he lands upon criteria, which are clarity and distinctness, for building up that which he can trust. But the sort of fixed point for Descartes, even as he is able to doubt the evidence of his senses, he's able to doubt his perceptions, he cannot doubt that there is a thing, a thinking thing that is perceiving. At the moment of perception, which is a form of thought, according to Descartes, there is an I. Okay, so think of that as a sort of still fixed point. As we know from Freud, right, it doesn't take Lacan to say that humans are not transparent to themselves, right? This is one of the fundamental insights that we get from early on in Freud. You know, our motivations are largely unconscious. We are strangers to ourselves. But what Lacan is doing here is setting up something that is really thematizing that I, that subject. And in the moment when, as we'll discuss in a couple of minutes, when we get to like the actual scene, setting the scene of the mirror stage, like what's happening, what is this stage, that in the moment when it seems like we are forming a stable self, that self is always, you could call it in sort of classic Lacanian language, you could call it split. I almost might want to call it like sutured, like torn asunder. So the point here is that anything that takes the I as a stable base from which to build knowledge is itself going to be diametrically opposed to the Lacanian project.
And again, it's really weird that here, like in a clinical paper, or a paper that's ostensibly clinical, or at least a paper that's being delivered at a gathering of clinical psychoanalysts, Lacan is like saying, you know, and our whole field, or us all in psychoanalytic experience, we stand against this 17th century French philosopher and his basic conclusions, which underpin the entire like positivist system of a certain type of rationality.
And a certain type of empiricism.
Exactly, because to put in different words what Abby said so well, right, what the Cogito does, right, is it grounds indubitability, certainty, the lack of doubt, in a singular first-person rational subject, right? And that's given. Whereas Lacan is going to argue, well, he's already suggested that I is a function. Moreover, it's kind of worth saying here that if it's a function, it has to be constituted. It's not necessarily given. It can be built up, and it can also come apart. And it's worth saying here, too, just to get a further handle on where this is going, because Freud, again, is a thinker of you know, he engages with Descartes, but not quite like this. Freud is a thinker of the ego, of the id, of the person, but not of this thing called the subject. Lacan is also going to be a thinker who is operating in a different moment, which people are talking about subjectivity, because of like the relatively new field of linguistics at this point, Saussurian linguistics specifically, but also who is keen to think about critiques of the Western episteme more broadly, and critiques of the Cogito that he's already familiar with and that some of his audience might already be familiar with.
Yeah.
It's worth saying here, just to quickly point to that, right, that if you look at, well, the Latin, cogito ergo sum, you will note that these are, well, for those of us who have Latin, right, that there's no like pronoun in there. Latin could add a pronoun as a matter of emphasis, but it doesn't. Instead, with cogito, I think, and sum are marked in the first person, right? It's I am, therefore, rather, I think, therefore I am.
The I is assumed from the get-go.
Exactly.
No, it's not assumed. It's built into the verb.
It's smuggled into the verb, right? That's another way of
Sorry,
saying
not to be like a language snob.
Well, it's assumed as a given in the sense of it's already inscribed into cogito and sum. But as Bertrand Russell at the time will say, you know, Bertrand Russell, a major thinker of this, and also existentialist thinkers like Sartre, who we know Lacan is quite familiar with, and who mounts a similar critique of the cogito. How do we know that the I that is doing the thinking is the same as the I that does the existing? Why not two separate I's? That could just be an artifact of language. Moreover, there's a kind of bootstrapping character, or another way the I is smuggled in, insofar as that if we were being really tightly parsimonious to describe the grounds of all thought, we can't really say, I'm thinking. It's rather, thinking is happening over here, or there's thinking. And I'm now going to ascribe an I into it in language.
Yeah,
now,
that's the bootstrapping.
That's the bootstrapping. Both the Russell and the Sartrean and ultimately the Lacanian critiques of the Cogito, what they kind of point to is how this thing which is supposed to be the ground for all subsequent knowledge, right? And Descartes will deductively from this Cogito do everything, including develop a series of optics and theories of how perception works and mirrors work and all that stuff too. That thing is actually not a unity. It's actually kind of artifact, a gesture that is constituted. So what Lacan is doing is basically saying, no, this thing which an entire positivist, i.e. very empirically oriented, subject-object, very secure vision of the thinking rational person, that's not actually on firm ground.
Right.
That's not a given. And at that point, it might be worth finally saying, with an eye towards what Abby said, and also something that's come up in our readings of Freud, that at the beginning of Descartes' meditations, Descartes banishes from possibility as just a sheer exigency, as an imperative, as like something that he can't accept, the idea that, one, he is hallucinating, and two, that like he is actively being misguided by a demon.
By the evil, deceiving demon.
Right. Literally, like he has to imagine a demon. And it's
sort of like God, but evil.
Yeah, it's a demiurge.
I mean, I know we have a word for that, and it's Satan, but he doesn't.
What's a demiurge more, right? It's like,
or maybe even an evil genius. It's been a while.
It's the people who are running the simulation, right? But in any event,
he has to say we're not in the Matrix.
Right.
Yeah.
But he reaches to theological language to do it. It's almost like
it's kind of where a lot of this stuff falls apart.
So it's from the get-go, even before he builds it, right? It's like, in order for me to be doing this, I can't be hallucinating, i.e. I can't be dreaming or mentally ill. And two, I can't be being deceived either by some other that's gaslighting me or through some illness that I'm experiencing. In other words, the Cartesian Cogito is absolutely not the type of person, or is not the person in the full psychoanalytic sense, because in the psychoanalytic sense, one thing we always do is sleep, we dream,
and are constantly deceived.
And we deceive ourselves.
By ourselves and others.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
of course, it makes sense that Lacan would start out by kind of throwing this gauntlet and saying that we are at odds, which is, by the way, like a nice kind of echo of Descartes throwing down a gauntlet in Discourse on the Method and saying, actually, like everything that I've read before was wrong. So there's like a kind of interesting echo.
And it's worth saying here too, again, like we're spending a lot of time on this because we're unpacking it because it's so incredibly dense, but we also like remind ourselves for 1 second who his audience is here, at least in this international psychoanalytic. Lacan's audience, right? Not through the text, but like, as he's delivering this, he's with a whole bunch of psychoanalysts, clinicians, doctors, psychiatrists, other people who are attending this stuff. And like, look, sure, some of them were super smart, some of them were super erudite. And even some of the French, probably the last time they ever looked at Descartes was in their lycée high school years.
Yeah.
Right? So this whole beginning where he's like, and now I'm going to assume that we all understand both what the Cogito is and these various critiques of it that I'm going to implicitly allude to, and now we can and that's all what's under the umbrella of psychoanalysis. There are people in the audience that are like, what the fuck?
It's in one sentence too. He doesn't actually even say Descartes, he just says the Cogito.
And so people have to pretend to go along with this or like break out their old high school journals or something, but in any event, it's a weird way to begin. And then where it goes is even weirder. Namely, right after that, he's like, okay, now let's talk about babies.
Well, it's weird insofar, and maybe I'm repeating too much, but I actually don't think that's like really possible in this case. But it creates the possibility of a paranoiac reaction, right? Everyone else understands, and I don't.
I had two thoughts. One, spending all this time breaking down his relationship to Descartes in a single reference to like one sentence feels like a great example of what he does to Freud and the way he takes radical ideas and further radicalizes them, like reads more out of them than even the original person thought. And the other thing was, I kept thinking, I know Lacan is the subject supposed to know guy. Is that what he's doing? Is he recognizes himself as the subject supposed to know in these seminars. So he kicks off his seminars by taking that hat, making it as big as possible, like trying to make an umbrella for as many people as possible, as you two are also subjects supposed to know. But then the weight of that huge hat makes it so that he's the only one that can actually wear it in the room. And everybody else is like aware of the fact that they could occupy the space if they were also as smart as him. So it's like he's both undermining the subject supposed to know position while going back around to reinforcing that no, actually he is the subject supposed to know. He kind of like has his cake and eats it too in this way. And you can see why people who are like, people would critique him and be like, oh, this person is basically like a guru style cult leader. Yeah. I get a lot of that out of Lacan though. I do. Yeah. And I think that's fair. It is this way in which like he's hyper attenuating our relationship to knowledge and the way in which knowledge is never just an abstract thing. It's always related to people who teach us things, to texts we encounter in particular times in our lives. And a lot of what we take to be the given terms of knowledge, like the basic building block ingredients of our systems of thought, are in fact what can in many cases, as is the case with the Cogito, be surprisingly untested or rest on elements that are not actually rigorously arrived at nor empirically given, but are instead kind of held together through gestures of language.
So let's get into the setting the scene of the mirror stage itself. Because as Patrick said, now there's going to be babies. And this is one of the few times where, for Lacan, we're talking about a particular developmental stage. Okay, so he's talking about babies, if you're picturing this in your head, somewhere between like 6 and 18 months. So I'm going to read the paragraph. This is coming right after that bit about the Cogito. Some of you may recall the behavioral characteristic I begin with that is explained by a fact of comparative psychology. The human child, at an age when he is for a short while, but for a while nevertheless, outdone by the chimpanzee in instrumental intelligence, can already recognize his own image as such in a mirror. This recognition is indicated by the illuminative mimicry of the Aha-Erlebnis, which Kohler considers to express situational apperception, an essential moment in the act of intelligence. Erlebnis is experience, and I think that's just the aha experience.
Yeah.
Like, you look in the mirror, aha. Okay.
Yeah, it's the baby going, "It me!" Like it's
light bulb.
It's that moment of like,
that was like such a good voice of like the baby from Dinosaurs.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, not the mom.
Not the mom.
Okay, whatever.
We talk about this on that
Anyway,
one.
yeah, different conversation.
Okay. So like first flagging the fact it's really weird we've gone from, and we all know these things about it, as we all agree in our critiques of Cartesian, like epistemology. Now let's talk about this baby and some monkeys,
and it's looking in the mirror.
And it's looking in the mirror, right? So I really want to unpack this very shortly, or rather very tightly, right? So it's taken as given that there's a fact of comparative psychology. We have the human child, and what's the deal with this human child in comparison to this chimpanzee?
Outdone in intelligence.
In instrumental intelligence, yeah. So more broadly here, let's just observe and take as read something that is oftentimes referred to as the specific, in the psychoanalytic literature by Lacan and others, as the specific prematurity of birth of human beings, right? Which is namely that babies are stupid as fuck.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we love babies. Babies are adorable. But there is consider, if you will, I don't know, a horse.
They lick themselves off and they like start running. I mean, what you're talking about is sort of the fourth trimester, essentially, of the baby's first 3 months outside the womb, when they really cannot do much for themselves,
yes,
including hold their heads up.
No, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but we can, I think, understand that because of the trade-offs involved in our sort of cerebral mass and the limited size of the birth canal and the other stresses that are imposed upon someone who is pregnant, we can't stay around in the womb, until I don't know, could do math, right, or something, because then we'd bust out like a chest buster in Aliens or something. It's not tenable. So there's a way in which we're born too early, and we, unlike that foal that can just start running beautifully across the plains, we are. We'll kind of say a lot more about this in a minute, but we are fundamentally dependent. We have no idea what's going on, and we kind of can't be left alone either. This is another thing to point out here, right? As opposed to animals that seem adapted to their environment. And like chimpanzees are doing things like a very young chimpanzee, for example, will have tool use, right? They will know they can
instrumental intelligence.
They can grab a stick and start going after termites, right? That they can scratch their own back against a tree, right? That they understand and can move through space smartly. Likewise, even actually, a kitten is a good example of this, right? There's some of these lab tests where you have a table, right, a coffee table type thing that appears to end and fall off into a void, but then you extend the floor of the table, the top of the table with plexiglass, right? So it doesn't actually end. Now, if you have a kitten, it will walk up to the edge of the table, look down, and be fooled by the glass and be like, oh, this is a steep edge. I'm not going to go over this. You put a 12-month-old on that table.
They keep going.
They just keep going. And it's not because they recognize the glass and are like, oh, this is just some researchers playing a trick on me. They just go right off that fucking table.
They don't register a risk.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of remarkable. Like, I spent a lot of time around babies. It's remarkable, the resilience of parents and the capacity of people to, over the course of a single day, prevent their babies from wandering into catastrophe is remarkable.
Yeah.
Right. And so here, Lacan is saying something, namely, that we are, in terms of survival, in terms of object permanence, in terms of tools, the human baby is, quote unquote, more stupid than a chimpanzee, if we want to use this language.
Yeah.
Except for one fundamental difference, which is namely that
they can recognize themselves in the mirror and realize that it is them. Right, as opposed to the kitten that's like, who's this angry kitten in the mirror?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is now, we can pass over the bit about this person named Kohler. What basically, among other figures here, what Lacan is drawing on are people who are involved in the school of what's sometimes called ethology, or this discipline of animal behavior.
Animal behavior.
And there's some overlap there too. And he's kind of familiar with this in phenomenology of nature and biosemiotics and stuff. We don't really need to get into that. But suffice it to say here, he's using a citation, which he may or may not have read, by the way. The guy read voraciously, but sometimes he drops names, and it's part of this erudition effect and the subject's supposed to know thing.
Yep.
But he's basically just saying other people have noticed that babies have this capacity to self-recognize. That's distinct. And other people have said that this must say something special about the human. All right, next paragraph.
So I'm picking up right where I left off here. Indeed, this act, the act being here of recognizing oneself in the mirror, indeed, this act, far from exhausting itself, as in the case of a monkey, in eventually acquired control over the uselessness of the image, immediately gives rise in a child to a series of gestures in which he playfully experiences the relationship between the movements made in the image and the reflected environment, and between this virtual complex and the reality it duplicates, namely the child's own body and the persons and even things around him. This event can take place, as we know from Baldwin's work, from the age of 6 months on. Its repetition has often given me pause to reflect upon the striking spectacle of a nursling in front of a mirror who has not yet mastered walking or even standing, but who, though held tightly by some prop, human or artificial, what in France we call a trotte bébé, overcomes in a flutter of jubilant activity the constraints of his prop in order to adopt a slightly leaning forward position and take in an instantaneous view of the image in order to fix it in his mind. So I hope you are imagining this baby, held up, I'm thinking like one of these kind of like walker things, or it could be also a parent holding him, but nonetheless, think about this baby facing a mirror, recognizing itself, leaning forward, and also think about and notice in the language that Lacan is using that there's play, there's joy. So rather than, as with the chimpanzee, who in some ways at this point is smarter in terms of like tool use, unlike that chimpanzee who's just like, yeah, okay, there's this thing, I'm going to move on. This baby is enthralled by its own image. And that sort of sense of enthrallment gives rise to movement and interaction with this image in the mirror.
This idea of being enthralled is really excellent. And I think it's a good way for us to think very granularly about what happens in this first paragraph that we just read, right? So we have column A, animals that recognize themselves in the mirror. There is actually a mirror recognition test that you can run on various things. I should say, just for the record, and maybe I should have said this earlier, we're reading the scene about the baby as kind of like a parable or a drama, which is licensed by some other stuff we'll get into, but more just to think about this as a scene on its own terms before trying to get too granular about, well, is this or is this not scientifically validated? I should say, there's some great apes that actually do recognize themselves. There's some that don't, etc. The point here isn't necessarily the developmental precise accuracy of what's going on. We can talk about that later, but first we need to get these themes down, this idea of enthrallment.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's helpful to read this with as like only slightly less like mythical than some classic, the idea of like the state of nature in social contract theory, right? It's a founding kind of myth. It may, or in this case, it has more basis in actual organic, observable reality. But we're not reading him as particularly as a developmental psychologist. We're reading this in a whole host of ways that are focused on like what right now is happening in this scene.
In other words, we're not just reading this scene as illustrative of a quote-unquote stage or stade, in the French sense, as like a developmental level, but we're also reading it as a kind of existential drama, right? Which is warranted because the other meaning of stade can also mean like a theater, right? The Globe Theater or something. Something is being portrayed for us, dramatized for us. It is a drama in that sense.
Absolutely.
Like Freud's primal horde.
Exactly. And in this way, the mirror stage is the scene of the baby in the mirror stage is one of those classic images of psychoanalysis, like, I don't know, the baby at the breast incline, or the child in the crib in the Fort Dot, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, tossing out the toy, etc. This is an icon that does work. And with that in mind then, column A, we've got animals that when they look in the mirror, what they see is useless. The uselessness of the image. The image is useless to them. When a chimpanzee in this account looks in the mirror, first it goes, is that another chimp? Does it want to fight me, fuck me, take my food? What? No, okay. It's like, no, that's just me. Okay, I'm moving on. It doesn't matter. It is useless to that. However, for the child is, as Abby says, enthralled. It doesn't immediately go, okay, this isn't another baby. This baby doesn't want anything from me. It's just me. That's a nifty thing. And then it goes on to, I don't know, like stick its fingers in a socket or whatever babies do once we've already established they're self-destruction machines. The point, though, is that this child lingers with the image. And so here we seem to be suggested that whereas the image was useless for the animal, it has a use or a function, so to speak, for the child. It catalyzes something. It gives the child something. So just to repeat this here, and we have the line here where he evokes another study, another scholar, Baldwin. We pass over that too, and also we have the dubious sequence of Lacan saying that he's observed lots of other babies. And given biographically what we know about Lacan's father, I find this a little bit doubtful. But besides that, right? Let's just sort of ask.
Imagine asking Lacan to babysit.
Oh my God.
Sorry, go on.
We're already starting to get a sense of, well, the baby's reaction first, right? The baby's reaction, what is it? It's yeah, and it's also it's pleasure, right?
It's play also specifically. It's not just pleasure as a sensation. It manifests in like a kind of dynamic, experimental series of movements and gestures.
A recognition of potential, maybe.
Yes, I like where we're going here. This is so a term sometimes used is that it's ludic, right?
Yeah,
which is saying playful, right?
Yeah,
and that's
playful.
another way of talking about the stage, a stade in French, right? It's an arena. It could be a stadium where you're playing soccer. It could also, though, be like a gladiatorial combat, like the Colosseum. We'll get to that in a second, right? But here you have the child in this what you might call a specular moment, a looking moment. That becomes a spectacle for it, i.e. it becomes a thing it starts playing. It becomes a
spectacle for itself.
Yes. In other words, we have a moment, the initial thing here is not an exhaustion of the image, but an investment in the image. A cathexis into the image, to use this language. And that cathexis produces pleasure, joy, and a sense of possibility and play. Now, in the second paragraph, Lacan adds a little bit to this, and this is where I want us to actually call back to Freud in a second, right? But as Abby says, this child is not necessarily walking or crawling. They're in...
That like what do you call those things? The like toddler holder thing.
Yeah. The Clot Bébé, apparently. Lacan. I don't know what we call them. None of us have kids.
Well, I don't think I had one of these as a kid. I don't know if they're still FDA legal. It's like, those things where it's like you pick up a baby that can't walk, and then there's like a...
Yeah, they still have those.
Like a wheeled
they
ring.
kind of bounce in them. Yeah.
But they can also move in it.
Yeah. I think they still have those. One of my nieces has one.
I don't know.
Where like the baby is sort of suspended.
Yes.
And here it's worth
because
saying...
they can't walk.
They just like bounce.
Yeah, they bounce. They vibe.
So
while bouncing.
So here's the thing to note right off the bat, right? One, just quick, apart from it's sort of like the questions of its intelligence. The baby is, a hot mess, right? It doesn't have good body coordination. It doesn't have optic permanence. I forget when babies get stereoscopic vision, right? It certainly can't control when it pisses and shits. It's always crying, right?
To be a baby is stressful and trippy.
Yeah. You are a mess. But the baby sees itself in the mirror and it's like, oh, that's me. I'm coming together as something. But, and this is the key thing, it's not actually the baby on its own. It could be aspects of the outside world. It's the baby in its little mecha suit. It's the baby in the arms of its parents. It's a baby in all its juvenile activity that is constrained by a prop or a tool. We might almost say that it is having a prosthetic experience. Yeah. There's a tool around it that is compensating for its insufficiencies or lack, but in any event is giving it a type of structure that allows it to do more than it could do organically on its own. And in that way, it invokes a classic image from Freud.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's there's that part, Patrick, you and I both quote this all the time from late Freud, from Civilization and Its Discontents, where Freud is talking about what, like the question concerning technology, I guess, to borrow Heidegger's phrasing by accident. And he's thinking about whether technologies, especially technologies that reach across distances, have made us any happier, like, phones, airplanes, et cetera, et cetera. Nice. And he says, man has become, as it were, a kind of prosthetic god, which is an interesting thing to think about in the context of this baby playing, baby in the mirror.
And the arbitrary, it's like when he puts on his devices, he's quite miraculous, but even then there's still like a childlike insufficiency in him. Yep. And so, yeah, it's the idea of like the child is seeing itself as being, because it's been held up in this object, and because it's getting the mirror in front of it, the child's initial moment of pleasure, which is also its first moment of self-identification, is in fact made possible. It's visual. That's me. I'm on my own. Look how beautiful I am. I can move. That's me. It's actually not just you. It's a whole series of things that are dependently holding you up, and it's also being mediated by. It's an apparatus. Yeah. Yes. And to put a pin in one word that Lacan uses here, that sort of begins to suggest the ways in which now this is both a developmental stage, but also kind of like almost a tragic drama, right? It's this idea that the child leans forward and takes an instantaneous view of an image in order to fix it in its mind. And first, note that instantaneousness, right? The child says, my experiences of my body are unruly. I don't even know where my body begins or ends. But this thing in me, sometimes I'm sleeping, sometimes I'm going to bed, whatever. Sometimes I want to be up when I shouldn't be, whatever. Right now, at this moment in time, this is actually me. It's as flat as a snapshot, right? It fixes someone in a position in that way. And it's sort of timeless. It's out of relation to time. But the notion of fix here, right, carries many of the same meanings in English as in French. Fix could mean, well, fix this in your mind. Get fixated on this thing. Get held up on this thing, enthralled by this thing. Fix can also mean correct something. Something's broken, thus you have to fix it. The child was previously a messy thing of limbs, but now it's been fixed into this totality of the image. But also the other sense of fix here too, and this is where we get that element of like taking something that's organic and alive and then stopping it in a moment. Yeah. It's like fixing a pin into a butterfly or fixing a creature into a collection. There's a type of, even in the making something live, a kind of pinning something down.
Yeah, I think this, we've only read a couple of, we're on page 2, right, of this essay. We are going to come back in 2 weeks with more. We're going to finish reading this really closely and carefully. But I think this is a nice moment to kind of leave our listeners with this sort of, joyousness and play and gestures and like the ludic, right, like you said, Patrick, because it's about to get really dark. And I want to leave us with a few lines from this book that we have been praising by Malcolm Bowie, who says the following: but jubilation and play have in fact a minor role in Lacan's narrative, which contains little by way of good news. At the mirror moment, something glimmers in the world for the first time. The child is still entirely dependent upon adults for food, security, and comfort, and still has limited control over its own bodily movements. But here, before the mirror, are the would-be autonomy and mastery of the individual in their earliest draft forms. The mirror image is a minimal paraphrase of the nascent ego. I want us to leave here with this sort of joyful, playful image of the aha before we pop the balloon, right? And before we get into the ways in which this moment, which right now is a moment of identification, that's me, before it turns out to be, twist, a moment of personification.
Where we're going with all this, and I think it's going to be fun, is, and also not just like theory, cant, or jargon, right? But you can rigorously read this essay, as we will, and as we've been doing, to arrive at a more robust notion of both the values and the pitfalls of identity or identification as a concept, but also thinking about the ways in which we attach to the notion of identity. The notion of identity and identification is not simply a given like the Cartesian cogito, or the operations of the Cartesian cogito, but is instead a dynamic process, and a process that we might want to, through the apparatus of what's called psychoanalytic therapy, but also through psychoanalytic thinking, kind of denature ourselves or reconfigure differently. And so we're going to wind up playing with this drama in all its beauty and its tragedy, going through this text and hopefully arriving at something pretty cool whereby you'll be able to see how identification can coexist with alienation. And how the desire for recognition or the desire to be identified or to identify yourself can, on the one hand, be valid and essential and major building blocks for our lives and for political movements too, but also involve some sort of relationship to time to change, and ultimately to misrecognition.
I was going to say to loss and to lack.
Yeah. That is not, again, given or eternal like the Cartesian ego, but is instead a dynamic, we might even say dialectical process, function, and drama. Dispositive, or it's like reinforcing the way in which when people want knowledge, it involves desire. It's never just an abstract, like, I want to know. It's always a relational thing. It's a relational thing, and like, I want it from other people. And even if I may not necessarily know what the content of like that wisdom or knowledge is, and wisdom, I mean it in the sense of a relation thing, like it's something you're sharing or not sharing. It has to be given in terms that already I can sort of anticipate. Like I'll know it when it's here. And I think that's, if there's any one thing these like Lacanian texts do in general, but I think that maybe Lacan will do for us as we go through our Lacanian period a little bit, like
era,
is that he kind of makes you confront the way in which like meaning is never just a what, right? It's never just a simplistic given statement. What Lacan makes us think about is not just like, well, what does Lacan mean, right? Or how do we understand these concepts and how can we then like rephrase them in the terms of like his own theory? He makes us think about the way in which meaning emerges as a process and as a relational encounter that is fraught with misinterpretation, with misrecognition, with anxiety, with desires to understand, the desire to be understood, the desire to have knowledge as a thing that you can use or put to some purpose that has its own psychic dividends. And I think on that level, what we're doing is, the reason we're starting with the mirror stage, even though it's not necessarily central to Lacan's thought, is that like the Uncanny does for Freud, it gives us a vivid scene, an evocative scene, or an evocative concept or term, but also through reading the way in which Lacan articulates the concept, we come to appreciate how Lacan thinks and approaches other concepts more generally, precisely through things like insufficiency, paradox, the architectonics of his thought. He might be a thinker who, instead of having steampunk hydrodynamic buildups and releases, is a thinker who thinks in terms of, say, mirrorings or puzzles or short circuits. So the suggestion we're trying to make here is that if you get the sense of how Lacan, not just like what this concept is, but the way in which he stages the concept as a problem, you will then be able to use that orientation to get a sense of how Lacan thinks about other things entirely differently. And also you get to make sort of your own Lacan in terms of using that orientation for purposes that you might want to.
We were having a conversation about this earlier. Well, we were talking about difficult texts and concepts, and some of it was serious and some of it was like a little bit like, I was like, Patrick, we're doing Lacan and people have all these sort of vexed relationships to it. And, if Lacan thematizes anything, it's lack and desire. And so two things. One, I was like, let me just confess, I've never understood the idea of the Deleuzean body without organs. Like, while we're just getting stuff out here, that has never made the slightest bit of sense to me. And he was like, it's the muffin man. He's all muffin. No organs. Anyway, what I really wanted to bring in is an aphorism from Nietzsche, which long before Lacan was even a twinkle in his parents' eye, was out there in the world, which is this: the attraction of knowledge would be small if one did not have to overcome so much shame on the way. And I think there's there's a lot there, obviously, and this is not a podcast about Nietzsche, and most of you would stop listening if I keep talking about this too long. So I'll simply say that even though shame is not a big Lacanian theme, I think it's one that we are working with here as we are trying to handle or manage the unpacking of this text, which, although it is only 5 pages long, we could do this for a year. We could do it for 2 years. And we would not be in a state of perfect connaissance, to use the French knowledge in the sense of recognition, where Patrick is saying, in some ways, the major Lacanian theme that we get from the mirror stage is méconnaissance, right? Misrecognition. But that there's something about, as we are trying to bring you along with us, we are trying to linger in that state, which is not necessarily either. I mean, and connaissance is also, it's like connaître is like to know someone, right? It's not about like knowledge, like savoir, abstract intellectual knowledge. I think we are really invested in not only showing you that to grapple with Lacan has to grapple with the unconscious, right? Or your own process of analysis, therapeutic or otherwise.
Meaning making.
Well, to be, in this sort of ongoing process of opening out onto the unknown, it really allows you to understand what Freud is talking about when he's getting into the idea of interminability. This is a text that is inexhaustible, and it's not only more fun, but it's also ultimately more useful to do the long, slow, circuitous, roundabout, seemingly tangential, definitely free associative route. And that's why we started out this episode being like, this is going to be 1 episode. And now I can tell you it's going to be 3. And we're like, it's going to be 2. It's going to be 3. A major Lacanian theme is lack, misrecognition, lack. These are all things that are about the absence of fullness or the absence of wholeness. But there's a flip side of that, which is the plenitude of interpretation.
Yeah. the first thing just I want to say is that,
do you know the Muffin Man?
The question of like meaning is, and its inexhaustibility, I think really is worth sitting with just for 1 second. Like, think about the last time you had a fight with a partner, right?
Well, this is an overdetermined example.
Well, it's an example of overdetermination, right? Because like 2 or 3 sentences between you and someone who, like your lover, right? You can not only result in a situation where someone has stormed out of the house, potentially never to come back, but you can reference an entire relationship, i.e. years worth of previous conversations that didn't happen, betrayals, characterizations, etc. Like, it's infinitely deep in some way. And arguably what happens in psychotherapy is even more so, right? Like, this is this Freudian idea that we continually betray ourselves, right? So I think that part of what we're trying to do here is to do justice to the way in which meaning making is intersubjective and very much something that reflects something about, we'll speak abstractly, but about the human, right? Like, I think one way we could read even what we're going to do in the mirror stage is like this. Lacan is saying, like, the human, per Aristotle, like the human is like the reasoning animal, right? The rational animal. That's what we do. We think.
Mm-hmm.
For Lacan, it's like, well, we're identifying animals, or we're desiring animals, right? And sure, that's a thing you could say to summarize this text, but it wouldn't capture everything in the text, and it also wouldn't make sense unless you've been through the text, as I'll suggest. And this is the second half of what you were saying that I think is very helpful.
About shame,
but also about like the anxiety of wanting to arrive at a determined meaning that will be like, okay, this is where we were going all along, and so you already can see the outline of the thing on the horizon, and thus you're always moving towards it. Right, when you think about it, is a type of a relationship where, like, here's the goal, here's this thing I see in the distance, I yearn for it, I want to arrive at it, and it will satisfy me when I get there. And I think that dynamic of attraction, of a journey that's predetermined, of a fate that's predestined, and which could be captured in these little phrases like, look, there's misrecognition at the heart of identification, right? Or we are not self-identical. All these little statements, again, that could be described as what this essay means, that the full stakes of that yearning and the ways in which we might be able to not necessarily do it or think more critically about it or live in a way that's less painful in relation to it is something you can only fully appreciate once you've gone through the process of the text itself, right? The destination changes as you get there. And what we're preoccupied with here is, and I think what makes psychoanalysis so interesting, is less like, here are a set of concepts, but rather it's how the concepts work together, or how different concepts can work together as part of a way of thinking, right? It's not just a set of meanings, it's a way of interpreting meaning and making meaning and seeing meaningfulness in things. So it's a process and an orientation more than it is just a structure, a vocabulary,
a destination. You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Danielle.
And today we are heading into part 2 of our multi-part episode on Lacan's Mirror Stage. And for those of you who are reading along with us in the Bruce Fink translation of Écrit, we are on page 76. A full page and a third into where we started last time. And with your permission, friends, I would like to read a paragraph.
Let's do it.
Let me just set the stage. Where we left off, the baby was jubilant, right?
Mm-hmm.
In front of the mirror, confronting its own image. And we left off being, the aha experience. Everything seemed great. It's all going to be a little bit downhill from there. So now we're going to get, stop that. Now we're going to get into what is meant here by identification, which is going to be more complicated than the recognition of the self in the mirror, right? That initial aha moment. We're going to decompose that in a sense. Okay. So now I'm quoting Lacan. It suffices to understand the mirror stage in this context as an identification in the full sense analysis gives to the term, namely the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image that is seemingly predestined to have an effect at this phase, as witnessed by the use in analytic theory of antiquity's term imago. And before we dive into that, I'm also just going to remind people that we are thinking about this baby around 6 to 18 months. So as you visualize, we are fully in the realm of imagination, the image, the imaginary, the specular, blah, 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 blah. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So have your imaginary baby and your imaginary mirror at imaginary hand. Patrick, what's going on here with identification? And perhaps we'll also want to get to this term, the imago, after that.
Yeah. So let's just lean for 1 second on the word identification, right? As a noun, identification, what can it mean?
To see myself in something else.
What's closing the gap? I mean, it's to predicate something of an I guess.
So I write myself into a scene, or
Well, I'm thinking like almost grammatically, like I am tired.
Yes,
I am special. I am a girl. Like literally, like to predicate, like there's some sort of thing that is an I. That's what I would think of. And there's some sort of
there's a copula.
There's a copula. Yes, thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. The copula is the am. And so to identify with a thing, and maybe this is like philosopher brain going on, is like to predicate something of the I that melds it with me. I take it on. Again, so closing of the gap by way of that copula. I realize that like that's not what Lacan means, because this is all like babies don't talk, right? And so I'm adult Abby is reaching for this language that is not there, and that's I think partly where you're going in some way. That identification here involves the image, and it also doesn't have that self, that I already there to predicate.
That is where I am going, and that is Lacan doesn't just stage the problem of how do we know what the baby first experience of identification is, nor still is it just underscoring how it's difficult for us to talk about that infantile, i.e. an experience for a non-speaking child, experience as adults without using adults' concepts. He's also using the example in this mythic way of the child taking on its first identification to do work at exploding, criticizing, or otherwise making us think differently about the stakes of our adult notions of identification in general. So identification, whether we look at it philosophically as, say, a statement of equivalence,
right,
or as the selection of certain attributes that produce a relationship of equivalence between entities. Or we could look at it as the act of identifying. Identification as a noun in that sense is just simply that action. So it could be both a given quantity, or it could be a relationship or an act of relating. It also is like very literally, identification is the thing that you like carry in your wallet and that you have to produce in order to drive, or like when a cop asks you for it, right? So identification in all these different senses is somehow implicated here, but that identification is structured as, it is troped as an assumption.
Right. I think of it as like the putting on a mantle in some sort of way.
When you assume the robes of office,
Right, exactly. But I mean, the thing, and we're going to get to this in the very next paragraph, because there's some already like necessarily misleading language here. When Lacan says like the subject assumes an image, is like there is no subject yet, right? We are talking about the very process of subject formation. So in some ways, and again, we're going to get to this in the next graph, there's something kind of wonky or misplaced about the very language of there being a subject already there to assume an image. So it's more like, get rid of that language of subject, get rid of that language of I, and actually just imagine the thing in the mirror and some sort of nascent sense of self, which is only coming into being through the sight.
And he calls that an assumption, right? It's both a premise for the creation of this little infantile person, and like the template for all our adults talking about identification, it sort of captures its insufficiencies or captures its stakes. So it's both a premise for something, the creation of a person, but also it sort of preemptively misses something as well, right? It writes the self into the mirror. It's the baby sort of feeling or finding itself jubilantly, but that's what creates the self. And we can only see this retrospectively. The other term that I think is very germane here is the weaning he puts on this Latin word imago.
Oh, good. I was just going to ask you if you wanted to flesh that out a little bit.
The imago, right? The idea of like it has a sense of image in the Latin, but also it's related to the word for copy, or for like, we might even say is like a simulacrum or a reproduction of a thing. It's the image of a thing. It also has, and this is a meaning that I only learned recently from a student, in fact, is that it has a sense in biology and specifically entomology, in which the imago is the form of an insect when it reaches its final maturity, i.e. such that like, if you were to like look up a butterfly, you would get an image not of the little grub or the cocoon, or the caterpillar or the cocoon, you would get the fully hatched butterfly.
They call it that sometimes, at least in like older writing, that like the butterfly you see pinned, that's the imago.
It's both a destiny, it's a destiny that you move for, it's the predestined final form of your development, it's the telos, and also there's this language of fixing, of capture, of like pinning down, of correction.
Is that also where this word predestination comes in?
Yep. This is why he calls it like a template for all subsequent identifications. The idea here is that the child seeing itself in the mirror, which makes the child, which is like the initial scene of the child identifying itself as a child, basically, or creating itself as a site of identification that it can then attribute things, that it can then see equivalence or similarity, all those things we just talked about.
That it can predicate things.
Exactly, yeah. It involves a kind of like orientation, not just towards like an ideal form or to like some sort of process of orientation towards the future. It also involves a kind of bootstrapping in the present.
Can we read the next paragraph? And I think that's going to kind of get us there too. Because what we're getting to, in some ways, is like the change in this nascent subject with the realization of some sort of externalization that doesn't map on to the felt self. Okay, so I'm picking up right after I left off with the paragraph that involves Patrick's favorite adjective. I can tell from listening to him talk about this, jubilant. Okay, I'm now quoting Lacan again. The jubilant assumption of his specular image by the kind of being still trapped in his motor impotence and nursling dependence. The little man is at the infans stage. Thus seems to me to manifest in an exemplary situation the symbolic matrix in which the I is precipitated in a primordial form, prior to being objectified in the dialectic of identification with the other, and before language restores to it, in the universal, its function as subject. Close quote. I want to flag here that, we've been talking about like the nascent I or subject, but before baby sees baby in a mirror, baby, I'm getting rid of the I language. I'm just going with baby. Baby feels like a mess in this top baby, like can't stand up by itself, constantly flooded by sensation, perception, not able to navigate the world, insufficient motor. I mean, I'm not like shaming, not like baby shaming I'm just saying like at this stage, like a baby doesn't have all of the motor skills that an adult does. So motor impotence, right? Can't get around the way that it wants to, in the way that as an adult, many people can aim themselves at a certain point and then walk there. Can't actually hold itself up, can hold its head up at this point. But the point is, this is not a creature that could survive on its own, right? It doesn't have control of its limbs.
It doesn't have an idea of what it is.
Yeah, yes. I mean, that's what we're working through. But what I'm trying to give you is a sense of like, this is not a fawn or a foal or something that like a few hours after birth can like get around.
Yeah.
This creature can't do anything for itself. And so it feels like an incoherent mess. All right. So that is primary before. So that's baby. Okay. Baby is an incoherent mess. And then baby sees baby in the mirror.
We also, I think, don't want to hang this too much on a specifically biological notion of development insofar as that the second half of that graph you just read, right, where Lacan is like, there are later identifications. There are identifications with, say, I am the child of this person who is nursing me, or I am a 2-year-old now, or I'm a big boy, or I'm a proud kid. American, right? Like all these different ways in which you get
American baby.
Yeah, all these different ways in which I'm the president again. All these ways in which, like, again, these other operations of identification.
Yeah.
Which could be as sophisticated also as, like, I don't know, 16-year-old me being like, oh, no, officer, I'm actually, and I take out the fake ID I got at the little bodega, right? Like all these different ways in which to understand, like, identity is both a thing that you get pulled into, i.e. interpolated, and yes, this is where Althusser gets that concept. We'll talk about that later. But also ways of, like, producing your own identification or being like, I'm a Samantha, or I'm really sad right now. All these different things.
Like a Samantha from Sex and the City.
That's exactly what I was going for.
I didn't see that coming.
All the subsequent operations of identification, right, are prefigured, or everything you need to know about the fundamental dynamics of those later identifications is implicated in this founding act of identification in which a helpless child who has neither control over its own body nor the capacity to use language to describe what it's experiencing arrives at a fictive, or we could call fictional or imaginary, but in any event, temporary in space and time and mediated through a mirror sense of holism. In other words, the grounds of the self, of that I, which is implicated in all those other later identifications, departs from the initial shaky sort of foundation of our constitution of self as mediated. To put it very succinctly, Lacan seems to be suggesting that prior to any other identifications, or like the basic structure of all these later, more sophisticated identifications, lies the haunting image of
the finding of the self outside the self.
Yes, and of the baby, a desperate baby who, is incapable of caring for itself, but somehow seems driven in the way that foal is driven to run, to identify, to laugh, to play. Like we're identifying animals, to look in the mirror and say, it me. And take pleasure in that rather than, concentrate on learning how to run.
Right. And again, this is prior to language. And I want to just stress this phrase from the passage I already read, that this is, Lacan says, this is how the I is precipitated in a primordial form. All right. This is a sort of primal scene of the sort of like incipient self. Again, I'm quoting, prior to being objectified in the dialectic of identification with the other. Right. So even before the self is constituted in and through the other, there is this self that is coming into being, but it is coming into being in the gap between the messiness of the feeling body and this thing in the mirror that seems a whole lot less messy, that seems like one thing.
It's fixed, right? The mirror fixes you to the extent to which it gives you an image of yourself in your idealized form, right? Think here about, I know we're going very linearly through these concepts in a very basic way, but if you're already starting to think about like Instagram selfies or like the best self you construct for others, you're on the right track, right? The idea here is that the original moment in which the baby is like constituted as like a demi-subject.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, is its moment of self-identification is actually a misidentification or an identification of itself as something that is actually outside the self, that is actually just a reflection of a self, or to put it again, this is why this is so hard to summarize without sounding like paradoxical cant. The thing that you think is actually you is just a reflection of you frozen in time that catches your attention and that you take pleasure in. And that becomes the desired template for all subsequent identifications, or at least the basic format of identifications.
Before other beings, other actual beings come into the mix in terms of the constitution of how one understands oneself.
And to reprise what Lacan said just several paragraphs above, right? This dual sense, one, that the thing that I am is actually a artifice of a assertion of selfhood through mediation and alienation.
Artifice or artifact?
Both. I mean,
Yeah.
but like, yeah, the mirror, like, this isn't the child, like, it's a mirror that somebody put there in a wall, right? Like, it's worth even spelling out the degrees of alienation, right? Not only is the child an inchoate shitting mess, right, in a truck bay being held up because otherwise it would faceplant, right? The thing that's in the mirror is a two-dimensional, flipped on that axis artifact of technology and light being like reflecting back into the eyes of the child, right? There's a whole different series in which that child is not, the thing in the mirror is literally not the child, but perceiving the thing in the mirror makes the child capable of, in this account, subsequently articulating or participating in more complicated operations of identification down the line. Exactly. And the stakes of this are, as in that paragraph earlier, at once libidinal and a libidinal dynamism, right? This is a dynamic. I want to be this thing.
Every time I read this, I have this like mental, I don't know if this is helpful at all, but I have this mental image of like a laptop, desktop background. And the baby has been going through life gathering files, like video files, audio files, all this stuff. And it's just, have you ever seen like a really messy desktop background? Like icons everywhere. You can't find anything.
To clean mine up.
And then the baby looks into the mirror and all of a sudden it creates a folder called me and it can start sorting through all those things. And then the things that it chooses to drop into that me folder have repercussions. But either way, like all of a sudden now we have this one thing that kicks off organization and we can start mapping all this stuff and like the desktop starts getting cleaner and more parsable over time.
Yes.
Beautiful.
It's a gestalt.
Yeah.
I promise we're not reading this in the entirety of this essay out loud, but this page we are going paragraph by paragraph. And then at some point we're going to start skipping when Lacan starts talking about like locusts and pigeons and gonads and stuff like that. But for now, important to walk through. I'm picking up right where I left off. This form would, moreover, have to be called the ideal I, if we wanted to translate it into a familiar register, in the sense that it will also be the rootstock of secondary identifications, this latter term subsuming the libidinal normalization functions. But the important point is that this form situates the agency known as the ego, prior to its social determination, in a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible for any single individual, or rather, that will only asymptotically approach the subject's becoming, no matter how successful the dialectical syntheses by which he must resolve, as I, his discordance with his own reality. One just sort of technical note that does appear in the footnotes is that Freud does say ideal I. This is a term that Freud uses like fairly liberally. I think of it as being like a early Freud before we get like thoroughly into the idea of the superego. But Lacan pretty much uses it here and then drops it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to note that.
A gloss to helpfully sort of situate what's at stake in that, right, is that this idea of the ideal I, again, I don't want us to go down the technical rabbit hole of Freud's theory of narcissism, but one thing that...
Although we'll do an episode on it at some point. It's a great essay.
Yeah.
Cats and babies.
Cats and babies and women, cats and babies and their indifference to adult men.
Can you blame them?
What is at stake here in talking about ideal I's or social determinations, etc.? Let's just succinctly say that a recurring question in any theory of development is how does the child come to understand who itself as someone either worthy of love or that has a that is deserving of its own efforts of self-preservation, right? Just the most inchoate impulse, like how does the baby know that it is a thing that needs to avoid pain, right? But also later, well, how does self-esteem come from?
No, I think I'm following you, but I think you're maybe conflating two things. Like one as how do you feel? Not even understand. How do you feel like you are a thing? Because in order to move around in the world as like a toddler and beyond, there has to be some sense of self, even if you want to think of it as fundamentally fictive, right? That sense of wholeness. But in order to navigate the world, you need that. And that is the foundation of, stability, fictive or no, on which you can then build what you're talking about in terms of like deservingness.
So technically what we're talking about here is like what's the initial investment of the infant person in their own like self-preservation or their own awareness of themselves as like a physical quantity is something that Freud was going to talk about in terms of like primary narcissism, right? But there are also these questions of like, how does the child come to develop a more sophisticated narrative sense of self based upon the feedback from others, right? When the mom picks up the child and is like, I'm so proud, I love you so much, I'm so proud of you, you just did this, right? Or dad's like, you're my, I love you so much, son, when you're great at baseball, right? Like, in other words, the way you start picking up internalized images of who you should be, that you want to be, right?
Again, that gap between the feeling self and the specular image.
Yes. So these are these later, more sophisticated things of who I should be and who I must be and who I actually am, et cetera. Underwriting all of these, though, and kind of undoing them or pointing to an anxiety that goes under all of them is this initial encounter, which is actually a non-encounter. This original act of identification, which is both an act of identification and an arrival at an identification, but what he describes as an asymptotic relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is this is a term from math, right? If you think about like a curve that is approaching a line but never arrives at it. and it's always getting closer and closer and closer, but there will never be an actual collision.
So when a function, and here we are back to the title, behaves asymptotically, the variable or the quantity, whatever it is that we're looking at, is always getting closer to a point, but never actually is at the point.
Right.
Right.
Right. And it never will.
Right. It's predestined. It's oriented towards this thing.
Not when you're born, not when you die.
But it can't ever get there.
Right. And I think that like let's get out of like theory world for a minute and into the uncanniness, to go back to what you're saying. And maybe we'll learn some things about ourselves and also about like gender and relation to mirrors in this conversation. But like there's an uncanniness every time you look in the mirror, because you don't ever see, in a very basic way, the mirror stage is dramatizing the irreducible difference between a first person and a third person perspective. Okay. Like, so you are moving around in the world and you're seeing things, you're smelling things, you're tasting, whatever, all five senses, right?
All of them.
All of them, all five of them. Yeah. But you are never seeing yourself. As Patrick always likes to say, glossing Lacan, like you can't see the back of your own head, but also you can't see the front of your own head, right? And so the thing that other people see when they see you is the thing that you by definition cannot see until you look into a mirror, which probably most of us do at some point in the morning as we gather the messy jangle of apprehensions and perceptions and feelings of tiredness and feelings of excitement and feelings of despair and whatever, and look and, try to put on some eyeliner and figure out how that thing that's looking at you is somehow the same thing, even as it's not the same thing as that surface to which you are, applying, I don't know, styling cream. We all have curly hair, so I'm looking at us being like, as we're all applying hair products, or as we're, and as you're going about your day, right, in the grind of late capitalism, right, you don't get necessarily to sit and think every morning as you look in the mirror, gosh, there's like a fundamental gap between my feeling self and the thing that I see that I am now presenting and that I'm going to move through and show everybody, right? You don't necessarily have that time to reflect on that. But I think for many people, to look into the mirror or to look at a selfie, to hold up your phone with the camera facing you is jarring.
Yeah.
And that I think is like a little bit clearer in some ways. Just like get a sense that jarringness, the what everyone else sees of me isn't how I feel. That's a gap. Like that is at the very foundation of the creation of selfhood before language for Lacan.
How does that connect to shame?
That's a great question.
I think, one of the words that Lacan uses is the Gestalt. It's that you see, and again, shame is not a big Lacanian theme, but I do think we're talking about it here. And it's the right word here is more something like lack or gap. There seems to be, whether it's baby in the mirror or it's, 40 something me in the mirror looking tired and being like, how am I going to get through today?
Yeah.
There seems to be something like that person, even if her hair is really messy or whatever, seems to have her shit together. Do you know what I mean? Like in that, like there's one entity that's there. And we don't always feel like one entity. In fact, we feel like there is this sense of like, you can't live up to that self because that self seems to have a wholeness, the specular, the image, that your felt experience of embodiment and movement, and just like the ways in which you feel different in the morning than you do in the evening. You can't live up to that image of yourself. And you could trope that as shame. I think for Lacan, it's more accurate to think about it as lack or misrecognition. But there is this thing is like, okay, when I look in the mirror, I recognize myself. But I don't know about you. Every day when I look in the mirror, I'm surprised. Maybe this is just because I have glasses and I don't really know what I look like. But there's something that's a little jarring every single day. And this is relevant too, because, as an adult, you are not just mirrored by the mirror. You're mirrored by every person that you come into contact with. And so, if I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I don't feel a whole lot like an accomplished self with like professional achievements and, all of these things, like I'm going to see Patrick and he's going to mirror back to me something that, might help me move on with my day. Maybe he gives me a little pep talk or something like that. But the way that I see him look at me shores up the sense of the self that is coherent, but there's still always that sense of the gap.
Another way of thinking about this, and I think that might be a way for us to situate the idea of shame or like anxiety about yourself.
Anxiety is a good word.
Yeah, it's a constant thinker of anxiety. Like that thing that was elegantly smuggled in the Cartesian Cogito. I think, therefore I am, and that I is me, and my assistance, both my thinking and my existence are self-present to me in this stable way. And, I'm a brain in the vat that does not exist in time. Is undone by the image
dream
of,
sorry.
Who doesn't dream, is undone by the image of this baby in what you could almost call like a tragic drama, right? The baby, it's tragic because it's damned to this in some ways, or it seems to be predestined as an act of necessity, right? But, and to be clear again, no, this is a parable. Clearly, there have been tons of children brought up in societies where they have no access to mirrors, right? Mutatis mutandis, we could use the mirror as a metaphor for many other things, right? Whether it be social recognition or hell, FaceTime or any other contingency. But the fundamental core of this idea that's captured in this image is of a child making sense of its experience, or rather the field of strange sensations and chaos that is the embodiment of the child, gets some degree of coherence in a way that's reassuring and pleasurable, but that is also an alienation at the heart of supposedly finding yourself or seeing yourself. And that puts you in a relation, and this is where Lacan is very different from Freud. This is about gaps and literal equations, even differential equations, of you're trying to arrive at an identity that you are never quite going to be at. And that kind of existential, so to speak, plight, or that like reality, right? You have to identify, but you're never just the identification, implicates every subsequent identification that you do, and suggests how there's a kind of insufficiency, both an overreach and an inadequacy to those other operations of identification that we do every day, or that we're forced to do every day.
Yeah.
And we could think of other examples that might be helpful here, whether they be as granular and specific as, some of the research done on asking people who have certain eating disorders, right, or certain types of dysmorphia, like what do you see yourself as when you look in the mirror? And the images that they're haunted by of themselves bear no rapport with their increasingly, skeletal and vulnerable forms, right? They're literally always trying to be something in the mirror that isn't even what is in the mirror.
Right.
Or it could be as, well, in language, in the symbolic, so to speak, as our self-credentializing as, well, as the father of a daughter, I believe I've come to understand this, right? Or as a responsible gun owner, right? Speaking as an American, or like, I'm not a lawyer, but like what I think Lacan allows us to suggest is how underwriting all those articulations of identification, which are also, could be of political solidarity or of your preferences in the world or of your identifications or disidentifications with others, and which are ongoing and dynamic. Think about, hell, like, why do people hang their degrees in rooms in places where they work? If not as a type of identification, right? The underwriting all of those is the desire to be the thing, or the desire to have arrived at the thing, or to have the thing, when in fact you're always in this position of trying to get to the thing, or being potentially anxious about not being there, ashamed with like imposter syndrome that you're not there, or kind of like malignantly insisting that yes, you are. Much as it's very difficult to talk about the baby's experience as an adult, I find it very difficult to talk about Freud without like using Lacanian language too, right? But like identification or identity in the fullest senses of the term that we hear it in the 21st century, from identity politics to all the different sort of like mathematical things, to even like the idea of having like showing ID as a way to extricate yourself or get into potentially life-threatening circumstances. That's not quite the way in which Freud thinks about identification. He'll talk about identifications, he'll talk about logics of identification and projection, etc. But the fullness of the way in which identification is like an ingredient into systems of what you could call power and knowledge and desire, that's a very Lacanian way of thinking about it. And this way in which the baby's primordial identification has these aspects of both pleasure, but also of a kind of tragedy, of self-presence, but also being haunted by a kind of absence, of like yearning to arrive. It's also taken as, oh, I'm here. I'm finally here. But wait, I'm never going to really be here. It makes me think of a mental image, which is comes from an experience that I've had and that maybe many other Americans, or at least some other Americans have had. If you drive for a commute and you pass billboards for housing developments that are going up, and they say, if you lived here, you'd be home by now.
Yeah.
I feel like, which is, paradoxical and infuriating, particularly if you're in gridlock, right? But I feel like every one of these identifying gestures, which we both are compelled to make, but which are compelled upon us, and which we desire to have arrive, but also they kind of lock you into a trajectory of never arriving at the thing. They feel like so many appeals that are underwritten with the tonalities of, if you just were this thing, you'd be home by now.
That gives me a very lovely segue into the next two passages that I want to read, and I want to read them. And this is the end of this section, but it's really about this idea of the Gestalt. Okay, so I'm quoting again. I'm picking up right where I left off. This is the final part of the section that we want to read from this portion of the essay. For the total form of his body, by which the subject anticipates the maturation of his power in a mirage, is given to him only as a Gestalt. That is, in an exteriority in which, to be sure, this form is more constitutive than constituted, but in which, above all, it appears to him as the contour of his stature that freezes it, and in a symmetry that reverses it, in opposition to the turbulent movements with which the subject feels he animates it. Through these two aspects of its appearance, this Gestalt, whose power should be considered linked to the species, though its motor style is as yet unrecognizable, symbolizes the eye's mental permanence, at the same time as it prefigures its alienating destination. This Gestalt is also replete with the correspondences that unite the eye with the statue onto which man projects himself, the phantoms that dominate him, and the automaton with which the world of his own making tends to achieve fruition in an ambiguous relation. Indeed, for Imagos, whose veiled faces we analysts see emerge in our daily experience and in the penumbra of symbolic effectiveness, the specular image seems to be the threshold of the visible world, if we take into account the mirrored disposition of the imago of one's own body in hallucinations and dreams, whether it involves one's individual features or even one's infirmities or object projections, or if we take note of the mirror apparatus in the appearance of doubles, in which cyclical realities manifest themselves that are, moreover, heterogeneous.
This is a lovely sequence that also gets us about as close as this essay is going to get to clinical material.
Yes, for sure. Good point.
And also goes
which is really glancing.
Yeah, and also
we see this in the clinical setting. Yeah,
and also goes into that stuff that like that basket of like both applied psychoanalysis and also a little bit of metapsychology and case history stuff.
Plus, and this is a bonus for you, it has that hint of the uncanny with the double.
Yeah, exactly. So at this point, I think we could read we could kind of do a Lacanian reading of the double here and be like, well, what is the double for Lacan? Like the double, much as it appears in fantasy, psychotic delusions, dreams, literature for Freud is a sign of the strangeness and the kind of torrid overdetermination of our relations in the family and of what we call home.
Mm-hmm.
For Lacan, the double here is about the anxieties of the assertion of identity and of a stability of self over and against the ways in which our bodies, or our senses of ourselves are not captured by that or come up against it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Whether it be, you wake up in the morning and then suddenly, I don't think about the first day I ever saw facial hair on myself and like how alienating that was, right? But also other types of alienation that I think are worth considering here. And this is the clinical stuff. When he's talking about like images of the imago of one's body coming apart, he uses some phrases like pièces morcelées, like cut up little bits.
This is a little later.
Yeah. This is his clinical work with people who are having psychotic experiences or who are hallucinating under duress or are just dreaming. You do sometimes have this image or the scene where like bodies fall apart, where bodies are laying in places and they get cut up in little bits. And Lacan, in his work on psychosis, finds this to be a recurrent feature of psychotic hallucinations, mm-hmm. of even everyday dreaming too. And in that way, he traces that back to this originary problem and anxiety of identification, right? It's haunted by that. So you're literally, your body is, identification kind of haunts your body with the fear of your body coming apart.
Right. That's that. I mean, and that's the sort of like the promise and the fear of the Gestalt, right? Of the sight of the self as whole over and against the felt knowledge of the lack of wholeness. I want to read, before we go today, I want to return to, so we are skipping, we are halfway through this essay, folks, maybe even more than halfway through this essay. We're going to return, because we've kind of marked this up basically in terms of parts that we absolutely have to talk about and things that we can gloss. Lacan now moves to this whole excursus on the idea of the Gestalt. He gets into like, I'm not going to say like animal husbandry, but like definitely into like a whole realm that is not as salient for us trying to read this as some sort of like primal scene of subject formation. And so we want to pick up, for those of you who are reading along, it's on the bottom of page 77. We're returning to the theme that has persisted here of both knowledge and the paranoiac relation to knowledge. Okay, so last long paragraph for the day. As I myself have shown, human knowledge is more independent than animal knowledge from the force field of desire because of the social dialectic that structures human knowledge as paranoiac. But what limits it is the scant reality surrealistic unsatisfaction denounces therein. These reflections lead me to recognize, in the spatial capture manifested by the mirror stage, the effect in man, even prior to the social dialectic, of an organic inadequacy of his natural reality, assuming we can give some meaning to the word nature. The function of the mirror stage thus turns out, in my view, to be a particular case of the function of imagos, which is to establish a relationship between an organism and its reality, or, as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. In man, however, this relationship to nature is altered by a certain dehiscence at the very heart of the organism, a primordial discord betrayed by the signs of malaise and motor uncoordination of the neonatal months. The objective notions of the anatomical incompleteness of the pyramidal tracts and of certain humoral residues of maternal organism in the newborn confirm my view that we find in man a veritable specific prematurity of birth. You want to talk? Okay, close quote. You want to talk about this idea of dehiscence?
Yeah. So here again, we have a layering on of further metaphors from dehiscence, which can mean in biology a very specific plant biology.
Yeah, so plant biology. Yeah. There's a lot of like animal ethology, plant biology. You got to admire the commitment to really just taking metaphors from everywhere.
And the through line in these metaphors, whether it be the imago or the plant, right, is this idea of there's like a form or a model, not just in these disciplines, but in the things themselves, a form or a model of what the organism is going to become, or should become, or must become, or can't but be impelled to become. Note, there's a kind of slippage here. It's not just descriptive, it's also kind of cryptonormative. All these invocations of whether they be plants or animals and their developmental schemes, well, they have a kind of rigidity to them, at least from Lacan's perspective.
Yeah.
A kind of quote unquote natural logic to them, which the human, in this paradoxical way, that's born like too early, or like the world is too much with it, you might say. It's too dependent on others. Its experiences and capacity for stimulus is too overwhelming. It has this response, which is both adaptive but maladaptive. We'll talk about adaptation in this essay next week, but which is that instead of being able to run, you identify. Instead of being able to go into a cocoon, you have this active identification that's necessary and important. But Lacan seems to be saying that on the one hand, as a model of getting locked in to a developmental trajectory or into a relationship to who you should be or should become, we can talk about human beings in those terms. But we can also, whether theoretically or personally or clinically, have naive, seemingly natural, which is why he puts that word nature in quotes, models that we expect of the subject or that we expect of ourselves to necessarily arrive at or to correspond to. And Lacan seems to suggest that those outcomes are not given.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or that we also might be losing something in the drama of the human and its anxieties and the way in which knowledge is the saturated with self-knowledge, but knowledge of others and the way in which knowledge of ourselves is mediated through others. All the different fault lines of anxiety and desire and yearning and insufficiency and all the movements and human dimensions of that, those reduplicate and proliferate through other types of identifications. And they're not as deterministic or as linear as these other supposedly animal models. And that this lies at the core of how we conceive of ourselves as subjects that are separated from the world, how we organize our own internal experience, but also how we live out the narratives of identification or the own sort of quote unquote destinies that we take ourselves to be naturally given, but which we have in fact assumed.
So we're going to leave off here in this space of where the subject, this incipient subject, is torn between the Innenwelt, the inner world, and the Umwelt, the world, the external world that it's experiencing and moving through. We're going to sort of linger in what is the sort of the truth of the subject of that distinction for Lacan. And when we pick up with our third and, dare I say it, final episode on the Mirror Stage, we're going to talk more in concrete terms about what this looks like, but also about what it means for the relation of the self to others, which we may frame in terms of the mother, certainly, but also in terms of the constitution of subjectivity once that self becomes a little more like chitinous,
yes,
a little bit more rigid, a little bit more armored, even though there's a real fragility to that. So what that looks like.
Now, all this may seem rather abstract still, even as I think we've gotten a little bit closer to sensing how actually this sort of parable about the baby might have relevances to how we position ourselves in social contexts.
Absolutely,
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Or how we're haunted by coulda, woulda, shouldas, or imposter syndrome versions of who we must be or should be or would rather be, or how we suddenly feel that we may be known better by others and are scared by it, or any of these other things. I think that if we really run with this, and we trace the implications and uses of this essay by others, as we will in the next session, we will, in a way that is not just warranted, I think, by the reading of Lacan or even by broadly psychoanalytic orientation, but that may also be useful for people who want to think about things in terms of, say, issues of political solidarity or the identification of constituencies, or this thing that is, or the many things that are oftentimes both done violence to and brought together as the phrase identity politics, right? I think we'll have a much more capacious and suggestive understanding of the role of appeals to identity, the shortcomings of appeals to identity, and the sort of the double bind, this paradoxical necessity where both you have to identify, we must identify, identifications are necessary, but also identifications are fragile, and identifications don't capture the whole of what's at stake in any given person, group, or moment. And that sort of difficult relation to both allow for recognition, but to understand how misrecognition is also inescapable is, I think, a properly political task. And as we'll see, Lacan is going to suggest arriving at that capacity to disambiguate, to think in those terms simultaneously, is for him the promise of psychoanalysis.
So stick around for the next installment of the Mirror Stage. We'll be back next week with a wild analysis episode. If you cannot get enough Ordinary Unhappiness, we do put out 2 Patreon episodes per month, and you can join us and support us and help us stay afloat at patreon.com/Ordinary Unhappiness. We are a podcast that is deliberately ad-free because we do not want to shill for things that we do not believe in, like AI mental health, for instance, and your support helps us keep going. If we can also ask you to rate and review on your preferred podcast platform, we would be so grateful. Thank you so much, folks. We'll be back next week. Bye.
Until soon.
Love you.
Dan, you were in my dream last night, and I mean that in a non-creepy way.
I take it in a non-creepy way.
Okay. But I feel like it was extremely subject supposed to know related, because in the dream we were in the recording studio, and I was trying to make a point. I was trying to be very, very forceful and persuasive, and my Professor Abby hat on and all of that. And you kept hitting the button on the mixing board that turns me into a chipmunk.
Nice.
Oh,
And
no.
I know. It was such a weird riff on like the I secretly believe that all academics have some version of the anxiety dream where you have to go back and like or at least I have the dream where I find myself back in my freshman year of college and I have to like major in a real thing or like some version of that.
Yeah.
But this was very akin to it. And so I was like, well, Lacan, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden
it started to, I became a chipmunk and it was horrible.
I enjoyed flexing this kind of petty power.
You should
Actually,
not, that soundboard was.
yeah, I like this. This is fun.
Make it stop.
No,
please.
Yeah.
But the real joke is on me because only Mike 1 can be the chipmunk.
Yeah.
Which feels like, and I'm Mike 1. Yeah, that's right, Patrick. You cannot be chipmunked.
you were unchipmunkable.
You're unchipmunkable.
So those big colorful squares on the thing, they don't.
It only affects the first track. I don't know why.
So
I don't know why.
You can't stop me or censor me or deform me. I could speak my truth. I could get fired for my truth. This is great.
I mean, in the sense that you're your own boss, you could be fired for your truth. Unless you want to make me your boss as Mike 1.
I'm having a crisis of executive function in terms of mapping out my inner org chart at the moment, and I'm not really
I
sure who is
can't
the
hold
boss.
space for this
Yeah,
at this moment.
The CEO has ADD at the moment and is completely unable to.
Oh, honey, you're not the CEO. I think we both know that.
I just like the arbitrary nature of this board having special effects go through a particular channel. That like hardware requirement has wheeled its way into being a central mechanic in a dream you had.
I know.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
How about mediation? Actually, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Do you ever like see how often are your dreams in the third person? Like, I'm wondering, like, do you ever like have other fragmentary, like encounters with your own senses, fragmentary style? Like, do you glimpse your face in a mirror? Do you?
It's never in a mirror, but I do see myself, and this is kind of bleak, but it's like in dreams where I die, before I wake up, I see my body.
Like a third person video
Yeah.
game?
You watch a lot of horror movies.
I mean, I was dying in dreams long before I started watching movies.
Aw.
Yeah, this is
Just like
that's normal.
ragdoll,
Right?
or-
That's normal.
Do you see yourself die in dreams?
Really try to avoid having dreams, but
I mean, that's
any
fair.
means necessary, actually. I'm trying to think about, like, do you ever have dreams where you experience the phenomena that Lacan describes here as like the coming to part, like your body falling apart or like teeth falling apart? Like, what's our?
I think that's a very common dream, especially
Teeth.
losing teeth.
I'm thinking about how weird it is in these dreams that you were describing, that there's this kind of this theme of even your dream self is mediated, right? It's even your voice in the dream is mediated through the soundboard, right? And
To be clear, I'm not usually a chipmunk in my dreams.
honestly, do any of you guys enjoy listening to the sound of your own voice when it's mediated in waking life?
Yes.
Really? Well, you have a lovely voice, yeah.
But I can't stand looking at photographs of myself. And I have been thinking about that as we've been spending time with the mirror stage. Because there is this idea in some ways of like the self in the mirror as like the real. I mean, that's not the Lacanian real, but as like the whole, or like somehow reassuring. And I've always found it to be like sort of horrifying. I mean, I don't mean my face is my face is fine. But I do find every single time there's a photograph of myself, I'm just like, that can't possibly. Like it's so distant from my sense of myself as like a being moving through space and like being like efficacious in the world.
Would you describe that feeling of like alienation or like discomfort with your mediated image as being similar to the feeling of anxiety that you get in dreams when it feels like your body is like not your own or it's coming apart? Like, I'm trying to wonder if like our everyday experiences of like, oh, that's not me, or I can't believe I look like that, or in my case, I hate the way my own voice sounds.
Do you?
Oh God, yeah. Like, I'm thinking now of like the family photo, like everyone gets together and they smile for the thing, and that's like the proof that Christmas was good.
Yes.
But in fact, Christmas was shit.
It depends whether you're in the photo. 'Cause I'm thinking about like the other day, Dan, you and Mahalia, that's Dan's wife, were gone. And so I took that opportunity to not only, let the dog out, but to spend several hours on the couch hugging Dan and
he's a good
Mahalia's
dog.
dog. Yeah. Well, he's my favorite. Behind his favorite spot, there are all of these photos of you and Mahalia like through time. And maybe because I'm not in them, I'm very captivated by like what's being projected there is like this like ideal couple form. Like it really like it lands for me in some way where I'm like, and I believe that you looking at that would feel the same. Whereas like
That's why it's behind the couch and not in front of it. It's to my back. No, aren't you describing like the joys of like voyeurism?
I'm thinking about that like line from Modest Mouse, right? Like other people's lives are more interesting because they aren't mine, right? And I think that is part of it. And there is a voyeuristic component, but also just in the register that we've been talking about, an image of another person that another person has chosen to put in the world has a togetherness to it, right? Whereas the image of yourself, or at least the fantasy of a togetherness that we can project onto it, like that person looks together, like they've got their stuff together. Whereas our pictures of ourselves are more anxious in some way, or at least they can be the grounds for a certain type of anxiety, even as also, they can be triggers for love or memory or all these other things. I guess what I'm really struck by is how in our dreams and on our mantelpieces, our representations of ourself, or like our experiences of identity, are incredibly layered and kind of, well, that initial joy of the infant in our story, like that unequivocal pleasure, which is, it's me. It's me, baby. There's a paradox to this tragedy, right? Insofar as that our identities are, per this essay, constituted through an alienating relationship to ourselves, right? So we'll get into. But that at least initially, Lacan presents this as being a source of joy. Yet so often in our adult lives, it's an experience of barely holding it together, of discomfort, of extended effort trying to prettify yourself, and in any event, a feeling of insufficiency, which more often than not expresses itself by the assumption that other people have the thing that you don't.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Danielle.
And today we are back for the third and what we, do I want to say promise?
We got this. We can do this.
Yeah, we can do this. All right, go team. We can finish a 5-page essay in 3 episodes. I believe in us. Even more than I believe in the inexhaustibility of meaning.
Actually arrive at the ending as opposed to asymptotically approaching and deferring and otherwise failing to satisfy.
We got you, because we can't make any more difference jokes around the house.
No,
I'm just, it's like it's enough.
We already have one perpetual project. We can't have 2.
Wait, that's the standard edition?
Yeah,
I thought you meant like ourselves.
Well, you're right.
Funny you should say that.
Patrick's working on slowing down. I'm working. What are we all working on?
We're all working on trying to approach a cohesive sense of subjectivity and authentic identity, which is ontologically precluded from us by the nature of the human condition.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so
Sorry.
we might not be able to do that, but we can finish an essay and an episode. Where we left off, can we do a brief recap? Episode 1, we left off with the joyful baby in the mirror. Episode 2, we left off. We were in a less hopeful place, toggling back and forth between identification and misrecognition.
Yeah, we began the whole thing by stipulating, as Lacan kind of grandly gestures in the beginning of the essay, that this is a philosophical account, right? Like he begins by saying, this is whatever our experience is of psychoanalysis, or our experience in psychoanalysis or as psychoanalysts or whatever the hell, it sets us at odds with the Cartesian cogito.
Yes.
and the solidity of the ego and its perceptions of the world, but also its perceptions of itself, which are what Lacan goes at as being the most fallible link in the chain, right? And to do that, after talking a lot about animals and a whole menagerie of things from primates to bugs, all of which give us these examples of like creatures whose development is more or less modeled biologically, or in the case of like literal insects, there's this idea of like the imago, like the final form of the thing, a destined development or growth. He gives us something else, something which is not quite biological and not quite precisely developmentally grounded to psychology, but instead a sort of parable. What we've chosen to read is a philosophical parable, and that is this baby before the mirror, who Lacan tells us experiences a ambiguous self-identification or discovery of their self in the image, which represents, as Malcolm Bowie calls it, the nascent form of the ego,
Yes.
Cartesian or otherwise, and which sets the child on a kind of trajectory whereby alienation and recognition are inextricable.
So where I want to pick up now is where you might be relieved or you might be disappointed. I don't know. To learn is the last big, long block quote that we're going to get into. And it's a little bit after we left off. In the first paragraph, you're going to hear is in some ways recapitulating some of what Patrick just said. But then it's going to take us into the form of the ego as it is experienced as like I guess we're kind of going with the insect stuff, a kind of carapace or armor, or, what later Anna Freud, drawing on, I think it's Wilhelm Reich's formulation we'll call character armor. This development is experienced as a temporal dialectic that decisively projects the individual's formation into history. The mirror stage is a drama whose internal pressure pushes precipitously from insufficiency to anticipation. And for the subject caught up in the lure of spatial identification, turns out fantasies that proceed from a fragmented image of the body to what I will call an orthopedic form of its totality, and to the finally donned armor of an alienating identity that will mark his entire mental development with its rigid structure. Thus, the shattering of the Innenwelt to Umwelt circle gives rise to an inexhaustible squaring of the ego's audits. This fragmented body, another expression I have gotten accepted into the French school's system of theoretical references, is regularly manifested in dreams when the movement of an analysis reaches a certain level of aggressive disintegration of the individual. It then appears in the form of disconnected limbs or of organs exoscopically represented, growing wings and taking up arms for internal persecutions that the visionary Hieronymus Bosch fixed for all time in painting, in their ascent in the 15th century to the imaginary zenith of modern man. But this form turns out to be tangible, even at the organic level, in the lines of fragilization that define the hysteric's phantasmatic anatomy, which is manifested in schizoid and spasmodic symptoms. Correlatively, the eye formation is symbolized in dreams by a fortified camp or even a stadium, distributing between the arena within its walls and its outer border of gravel pits and marshes 2 opposed fields of battle where the subject bogs down in his quest for the proud, remote inner castle whose form, sometimes juxtaposed in the same scenario, strikingly symbolizes the id. Similarly, though here in the mental sphere we find fortified structures constructed, the metaphors for which arise spontaneously, as if deriving from the subject's very symptoms, to designate the mechanisms of obsessive neurosis: inversion, isolation, reduplication, undoing what has been done, and displacement. Close quote. I want to say one or two things just for clarification, before we unpack this a little bit more. I think I might have said this in the previous, but the Innenwelt and Umwelt, I think we've talked about in some ways, but really it's the inner world and then the external world that as one is experiencing it. So that's important. I also want to just say that there's that, it sounds like I'm making up a word, fragilization, but actually in French there is a verb, fragiliser, like to fragilize, which I'm a little bit obsessed with because I once wrote something about it in Julia Kristeva about the idea of a text that could literally make one more fragile. Like the effects of reading something could actually work on your already existing fault lines, I suppose. But so, think about fragmentation, but also think about, again, like fragilization, right? And all of the sort of attendant or associated metaphors, images that you might want to hear there. I don't think fragmentation and fragilization are the same thing, but I do think they are related in an important way. And then the third thing is just to draw attention to, not only is this the place where Lacan here draws on that, very explicitly draws on the pun in the title, le stade de miroir, right? The stage, but also the stadium or arena. But for those of you who have been immersed in Freud, or those of you who work in academia and thus probably one way or another have had to teach civilization and its discontents over and over, you're going to hear that armed camp bit and think, I think quite rightly, of the famous section in Civilization and its discontents where Freud is talking about the psyche as not only a city, but as an occupied city, a city that is garrisoned. So we have this whole really interesting and competing set of metaphors here, right? This sort of the insect-like carapace, the armoredness, like the war camp, but it's also this camp that is beset or garrisoned, right? It's sort of riven from outside, right? And so we have armor, but we also have fragmentation and fragilization.
Not entirely coincidentally, the word in English, and I believe in French, for the occupation, a synonym for the occupation of a space with troops, and specifically for a city, is an investment.
Yeah, if this would be in German, right, for Freud, Besetzung, which we translate as Cathexis in French, would be investment also.
I want us to linger with this idea of an investment as we look at this real quick, both because I think one thing that may be kind of clear at this point is that this essay is actually quite repetitive in some ways.
Yeah, it's not just us.
No, it's not just us.
Although we might feel like it is.
But also that part of the character of that repetition is communicative, i.e. it's this layering on of these multiple images, of these different sort of tropes of being captured, of being constrained, of being deluded, of being, lured or trapped, right? And these images, whether they be the hard-bodied chitinous form of a beetle or the walls and crenellations of a castle. I think that layering of these images gives you a vibe, but it also gives you a sense of, it's like a world-building exercise, or it adds these, we can use metaphors to arrive at a sense of what he's talking about through this overdetermined layering of repetitions. And so just to recapitulate the repetition here is this idea that, actually Malcolm Bowie delightfully glosses this.
Yeah.
So the child, as opposed to the chimpanzee, has a perverse will, where the chimpanzee is able to recognize that the mirror image is an epistemological void and to turn his attention elsewhere. The child has a perverse will to remain deluded. The child's attention is seized, capté, by the firm spatial relationship between its real body and its specular body, and between body and setting within the specular image. He or she is captivated, captivé. But the term that Lacan prefers to either of these, and which harnesses and outstrips their combined expressive power, is the moral and legal captation, which is the complex geometry of body, setting, and mirror working upon the individual as a ruse, a deception, an inveiglement. The mirror, seemingly so consoling and advantageous to the infant, is a trap and a decoy, a lure, right, in the French. Now, this idea, I think he summarizes this drama beautifully, right? But the idea of it's a trap that you're initially drawn into with this investment of pleasure, but then once you're in it, it's a trap, right? And we're operating in as ever, a psychodynamic perspective or a psychoanalytic perspective more broadly, but what that emphasizes is dynamic, i.e. ongoing processes.
Yes.
And so the idea here is that initial investment in what Lacan calls a Gestalt, right? As a unity, that messiness in your body reproduced in the mirror that you now have consolidated in the mirror and identify with, that's the result of an investment. It gives us pleasure, but it's not just a one-time investment. It sets you in this trap that you're always working against to sort of find yourself as authentic or to be secure in some sort of identitarian mode. Now, what this suggests as a correlate to the idea that this is an investment, and this is a classic psychoanalytic way of thinking about it, is that under circumstances of duress, i.e. when our energies and libidinal investments, or our sense of self more generally, our ability to parse experiences, are flag, or are overwhelmed, or come under stress, then that can be expressed pathologically, But also in moments of disinhibition, i.e. dreaming in quote unquote normal people, there might be some expression of that initial investment there too. And so here what Lacan does for us is he says that in dreams, we frequently get the image of the self as like this castle, right? Or as like the house that needs to be protected. Whereas in other dreams, we also have expressions about that anxiety that's ongoing, that the body is going to fall apart. And here, just to close this out, in cases of severe traumatic distress, what he here calls hysteria, or very difficult, chaotic, and painful personality organizations, right? Or psychotic episodes, that investment is so taxed, or there's so many other pressures pulling at it, that it no longer becomes tenable. And so you have fantasies or hallucinations of your body falling apart, or you're obsessed with images of people being cut up, or you're, in other words, these limit case examples of pathology and our normal experiences of both dreaming and also of metaphor furnish us images of this basic scene of the constitution of self as actually a misrecognition.
There's some important material here that's a sort of, is it inside baseball? Yes. Is it important? Also, yes. So I want to talk about that. But first, there's one more passage that I want to read where Lacan is specifically talking about the exit from the mirror stage. So for those of you who are actually looking at this with us, which from what we've been hearing from you is actually a remarkable number of people, bless you. This is now on the next page. This moment at which the mirror stage comes to an end inaugurates, through identification with the imago of one semblable and the drama of primordial jealousy, the dialectic that will henceforth link the I to socially elaborated situations. It is this moment that decisively tips the whole of human knowledge into being mediated by the other's desire, constitutes its objects in an abstract equivalence due to competition from other people, and turns the I into an apparatus to which every instinctual pressure constitutes a danger, even if it corresponds to a natural maturation process.
And so again, to think of it in these terms of investment or energy, the idea here is that this originary investment in yourself, but that self is a fictional thing, is not who you actually are.
The investment in the fictive self.
The investment in the fictive self is, well, Lacan will sometimes talk about he'll play a lot with the language of duping or being tricked, right? Bowie has this lovely line, which is that the idea that even in the absence from the scene of anyone who could be thought of as a responsible agent, falsehood and underhandedness are somehow ingrained into the ego during its first formative moments. And the idea here is that because your subjectivity or your own relationship is constituted by this willful projection of yourself or willful projection of energy into something that you are not, that creates the self, right? Which is, again, it inscribes alienation in all the senses, if you wanted to have, from psychological, existential to Marxist, right? In the basic creation of the subject, then subsequent encounters with other people, institutions, narratives, ideas, whatever, anything else that operates on the template of saying, this is you, this is who you should be, right? Will speak to that desire for certainty and authenticity and cohesion, and exist in relation to those energies and investments that we have in who we think we are. And so when that's challenged, or when other modes of stuff comes up that goes against that, we get anxious or otherwise sort of askew.
I wonder if I can echo this back to you in other words to see if I can wrap my head around it in like a different way. So the child seeing their reflection in the mirror do they take on the position of the other with all of the baggage that comes with your assumptions about the other in order to see themselves as an individual for the first time? Meaning that perception of themselves is through this filter of what they imagine the other expects of them, which is also something above and beyond what they currently are. It's like unrealized potential.
Yes.
And then as the other, as their conceptions of what the other is and what expect from them changes, grows, gets pressures put upon it, that jeopardizes that individual self that they saw when they were in that position.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And
beautiful.
And we could say this just to really underscore the point about like what you're saying and what Bowie is saying, right? There may be others in the sense of other people, other institutions that come later, but the basic experience of yourself is as another.
Yes.
And there's a lovely line in French here that may be helpful, much as this line with the semblable invokes Baudelaire, sort of like my likeness, my comrade, my brother, right? This kind of indictment of the other.
Mon frère.
Yeah, my reader as well. But the Rimbaud line, which is from another poet, is "Je et un autre." The other is already there in me.
Yeah, the call is coming from inside the house.
Yes.
And that non-self identity primes you for everything forward.
Yeah, but I mean, yes, 100%. And what I want to point out about the turning point from what Dan just said to what happens in the passage that I just read is that this is the introduction of the other that is not the other that constitutes the self, right? So like the social other, right? So alterity, otherness is always present. I'm sorry if we're like beating a dead horse at this point, but I'm going to risk being repetitive rather than being misunderstood. The other is always constitutive to the formation of the self, but the exit from the mirror stage even if there are ways in which, we're always, it is still a stage, even if we can also read it as a parable about identity and identity formation. Lacan is still thinking about like an actual baby. We're doing in some ways a fairly literal reading of this essay because it will often get taught as, like the mirror is the mother, not the actual mirror. The mirror is other people, or the exit from the mirror stage is the entrance into the Lacanian symbolic. And so out of the realm of, when I say imaginary right now, I'm just trying to conjure image, out of the realm of the imaginary and into the symbolic, into the space of linguistic signification, out of the realm of the mother into the realm of the father. And I'm not saying that's not all there and available, but we're trying to really just kind of be like, what is in this text? What is the plain meaning? And what it is, as we see here, is the self is always formed in relationship to this fundamental alterity with which it is riven, yet the exit from the mirror stage marks the entrance of the self into the social and into actually existing concrete others in the world.
I want to put a very fine point on this question of exiting the mirror stage with an eye towards the ending. But for now, I think the thing to say here, right, is that the mirror stage represents a template of, you're being trapped in a relationship to your own self, or rather the constitution of subjectivity of this thing called the ego depends upon depends on mediation, and thus it's another way of saying this, it's otherness, right? Yourself, there's an other in you that makes you, abstractly, structurally. And the exit that we're talking about is not a solution to that problem, or an alternative to that problem.
It's a multiplication of that problem.
It's just you're now coming, basically you're still in the trap of the mirror stage insofar as you have an ego and are marked by investments in logics of identity.
Right.
But now, instead of it being the other that is you, it is other others, right? And that's where it's other people coming from the outside. It's other people, whether they be, a related concept here is Louis Althusser's police officer who yells, "Hey, you," and you turn around.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and this is, I think, very directly where we're going, the idea of your being initially primed for mediated visions of yourself that are other than your actual experience and which then make intelligible your experience, kind of primes you for specific others or other others to come along and give you accounts of, what your development must be like according to their narrative explanatory system.
Be a man.
Right. What your developmental neuroses or problems may be from a technical psychoanalytic framework.
This magnification that happens with the other, like all the others here, it feels like the repetition that you were describing. Lacan, he's piling metaphor on top of metaphor throughout this paper, but that also seems to mirror the way this alienation compounds as new variables and others get piled on.
Yeah, and of course, and these others are others, without even getting the fact that those others are also other human beings who are constituted under similar realms of regimes of non-self-identity and may have their own anxieties and investments and baggage, so to speak. It is like, you could see it sort of functioning as like the mental image I almost have is of like the adult version of the mirror stage, right? Is the person looking on Instagram being like, okay, now this fit, that's going to be the new me.
Yeah.
Right. Finally, this thing which is I've discovered in the world is going to give me the best, most authentic fit for myself. Right. And of course, the experience that we have of that is generally that it doesn't arrive, or then you need to buy something else otherwise.
Or you realize that the thing that they were selling you or convincing you of is functionally impossible, and it's actually the aspiration that's being marketed and not really anything attainable.
Exactly. And you put that clothing alongside the thing you have to wear for work if you have a job where you have to wear certain things for work. And that's also another standard which you are graded against. So in other words, this you're basically kind of ontologically groomed to continually be in search of discourses, institutions, experiences that allow you to declare, this is me, I'm comfortable with me, this is who I truly am. I finally have arrived at self-identity. But that's impossible. You can never get there, is the Lacanian idea.
Before we move on to the sort of closing moments of this text and spin out some of the implications, can we talk a little bit about what you could call a bit of like an internal polemic within this? It's a short internal polemic, but directed towards Anna Freud, ego psychology, and what that represents.
Yeah, and Klein comes in for some targeting here too.
Yeah.
Lacan not only has a critique of this thing that he calls the ego, and which he endows with a kind of like a tyranny and a fragility, and also, as we were just describing with these dreams or these psychotic fantasies, right, as a site of primary aggression or anxiety, of unfulfillment. Like on some part of you knows this thing is not you and may resent it, or some part of you may resent continually looking for some things. But that notion of the ego is not the notion of the ego that a lot of other thinkers propound. And some of those thinkers in schools like ego psychology try to think of the ego as like an adaptive, robust organ.
For anybody who is, say, not necessarily steeped in psychoanalytic literature, but has spent some time in talk therapy in the last while, I mean, like ego psychology 1 in some way. So if you've ever heard somebody talk about like a therapeutic alliance, for instance, that's language that comes from ego psychology. The idea that the ego is I don't exactly want to say a friend or a potential friend, but that I almost want to invoke here like the distinction in Buddhist philosophy between ultimate and conventional truth.
Yeah.
And like it's true that when I say I, what that I indexes is at every single time that I have said it throughout the history of my life, it indexes something different, right? It's a moving target. It is something that is in fact constituted in and through the relation to the other. That feels like correct to me to say. And so there is no like there's no Abby that you can absolutely pin down and be like that thing right there. Nonetheless, if Dan or Patrick or my students or my parents or anyone else in my life would like to have a conversation with me, interact with me, for me, in order to get out of bed and navigate the many roles that I have in the world, I have to act as though that changing self is something other than wholly fictive, right? Okay, so that's the sort of like ultimate Lacanian truth of it. And when in ego psychology, you get what I would call an eminently practical realization that you actually have to be able, you can't just every single time you say I or act like a self with some sort of structure of organization and coherence over time, you can't actually dwell in the existential rivenness by alterity in order to get shit done. You can't do it, right? You need some sort of sense that you are a unified self, even though that's not like strictly true. Right. And so ego psychology takes that sort of, I guess, conventional truth and runs with it and treats the idea of the ego as something not to be, named as ultimately metaphysically true, but as something that functionally needs to be experienced as integrated. And that experience of the self is integrated, which involves a great number of defense mechanisms, which actually come to be much of what you and others experience as your personality, that those defense mechanisms and that sense of self is generally speaking a net positive.
That's true. And I think for many ego psychologists, they'll even talk about the ego as like it's an organ that you develop. You actually want to flex it and strengthen it. It's better than, being enthralled to either your more id-derived impulses or punishing superego functions, right?
Sure.
But so in that way, what Lacan is doing here is actually a kind of polemical deformation or mischaracterization of ego psychology, because I think a lot of ego psychology is very useful.
Absolutely. He's drawing out a philosophical difference. And I think he's being a little unfair.
He's also being unfair to Melanie Klein and Anna Freud, who come in both because they have different theories of the ego and of how the ego relates to aggression, but also ultimately and possibly is also activated by the fact that they have actual experience dealing with child development and analyzing children, whereas this is but a parable for Lacan. But at any point, I think we can kind of be like, this is a philosophical deformation, and he's not being fair to them. And we can talk about all this.
It's a mischaracterization.
It's a polemic. We can talk about the technical reasons why, but I think where this goes, and for him, what is most interesting, or for what's for us and most interesting in this essay, is that he presents these schools of thought, these different schools of doing therapy, as examples of discourses that essentially have a model for how the subject should develop, what the person should ideally or most authentically be, and pathologized accounts of what they shouldn't.
Yes,
right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
In that sense, for Lacan, if ego psychology emphasizes adaptation, which it does, then that raises the suspicion that this is even more so than other schools of thought, a way of giving you a self or giving you a model for the self that is an artifice of power, right? And that causes you to invest in something that you aren't. And more broadly speaking here, at that point, he wants to go broader bore, and using ego psychology, albeit unfairly to do this, he argues that the core idea of who you are as a stable thing that is ratified by how well you adapt to circumstances is more or less divorced from any consideration of what those circumstances actually are, i.e. being a highly adapted ego, right? So like putting your ego back together so you can go to work as well as he suggests, like a concentration camp guard, right? Or a torturer. That to some extent, adaptation just means you're moving more frictionlessly against the social context. There's no moral or other sense to it. Right. And so for him, this emphasis on the ego, which he now starts describing as and the freedom of the ego is a sort of a false freedom and represents, well, at least in its vibes, in its metaphorical recapitulation of capture, constraint, grand destinies, insufficiencies, barely constrained violence, medical control, orthopedic models, biological destiny, religious narratives of who one must be, etc. It resembles various modes of like totalitarian social control or a reduction of the human in terms of its possibilities to, well, what he calls like a freedom that is never so authentically affirmed as when it is within the walls of a prison. Right. So he starts flirting here with a broadly existential critique of descriptive accounts of the ego and therapies of the ego that for him are actually prescriptive, tyrannical sort of refusals to recognize the alterity of the ego, and that also put the person on a glide path towards, well, not changing or doubling down on that problem.
So let me just read, just to kind of tie a bow on what you're saying, Patrick, let me read the line or two where Lacan really draws out the distinction between what he understands to be the sort of orientation of ego psychology towards the ego, which I would gloss as sort of like recognition, self-identity, congruence with the self, versus his take, which is, again, as we've been saying, probably sort of ad nauseum, about misrecognition. All right. So these notions, the notions generated by ego psychology, okay, these notions are opposed by the whole of analytic experience, insofar as it teaches us not to regard the ego as centered on the perception consciousness system or as organized by the reality principle, the expression of a scientific bias most hostile to the dialectic of knowledge, but rather to take as our point of departure the function of misrecognition that characterizes the ego in all the defensive structures so forcefully articulated by Anna Freud.
So in this way, Anna Freud comes in to stand. Anna Freud is like a whipping boy.
Anna Freud is synecdoche for ego psychology. Yeah. I think he's thinking about her masterful book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. I think that's what this is.
And in the background,
here,
just sort of vital to say here, just to gloss one thing, is that ego psychology, as he is characterizing it at the time this paper is out, right, and which was already starting to become this in the first draft of the paper, but is now the dominant. Is at the time of his writing is the dominant school of psychoanalytic theory, but also psychoanalytic practice and most mental health practice. Yeah. Among very saliently for him, North America, right, and parts of Britain. In other words, the people who supposedly won the war, the people who were anti-fascist, and who are now giving us the freedom of market democracy and the loving, in no way paternalistic care of like the national health system, and here is where I think we can start asking questions about like, well, what some others might call microfascism, et cetera. But like that the adaptation of working in the imperial core, so you can be a better Don Draper than ever. Right.
To what are you adapting? Yes. Right. Yeah. Is certainly the question. Well, a question.
It essentially it offers a suggestion that other schools of psychoanalysis can be more or less just sort of like feeding mechanisms for the reproduction of social systems of extraction, control, and violence, and
as opposed to the truly radical.
Yes.
And metaphysical correctness, I think, for Lacan of what he's saying. And I don't disagree, honestly. Like I think that's probably pretty right. I think the subject is fragmented from the beginning. I also kind of like having a self.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. I've grown pretty attached to it.
When you have limit experiences of feeling, a radical fragmentation of selfhood, that's a scary feeling, right? And I'm not saying that. I'm saying that descriptively.
Yes.
But the point is that Lacan can be right, but the sort of like court dismissal of ego psychology is a polemic.
So this brings us to where a lovely point, right? Because there are people who will take a kind of like a casual or constructive view of Lacanian / more broadly postmodern psychoanalysis, and then maybe they'll throw in some Deleuze and Guattari, et cetera. And they will seem to be like, well, actually, the solution, the like good exit to the mirror stage is, well, and then they'll say something like, is, a continual profusion of multiple selves, or, the vertiginous.
I like having those too, just to be clear. Yeah.
Or the vertiginous play of identity all the way down, or even a Vatic thing like the happiest a person can be is a schizophrenic taking a walk. And these are points at which, like, look,
right, that's from Anti-Oedipus.
We can say, like, we have to do maybe a little bit between like descriptive and ultimate truth, or the way in which these things are working. Like, yes, maybe rhetorically speaking, okay, if we see the ego as like fascism installed on the level of the subject, right? Yeah. Then maybe sure, like you might invoke the idea of quote unquote like some holy fool or madman or someone who doesn't respond to that as like a metaphorical alternative or as a superior option. But also, schizophrenia is not a metaphor, right? A psychotic experience is a tremendously distressing thing, and we don't want to valorize that naively. Instead, what Lacan does here, and it does have a kind of like I'm thinking of how you were building Abby to like his being like, well, now I've got something else, right? After he set up all these examples of Anna Freud's progeny and supposed heir, right? Or Melanie Klein, the dissident figure who is exploring the interior world of children, but who he thinks is actually just projecting concepts into the baby and doing a type of epistemic violence. And also, as he set himself in distinction to these ego psychologists who are doubling down on the problem and who he sees as basically just like monetizing mental health in this sort of like cruel way that might or might not also lead to fascism. He presents himself as being like, well, if earlier it was baby saying it me, now he's like, baby, it's me, and I'm going to tell you what the deal is. This is what real psychoanalysis is. And here he.
How long did you have that stored up for?
I just came to me imminently. But the point here is that like what he does is he now says, well, if we grant that this is inevitable, right? So if now instead we're not looking for an exit from the mirror stage, but understand that on the level of how it describes the inscription of alterity in the subject, there literally is no exit.
Yeah.
Right? What is the other possibility? And if they're bad psychoanalyses that are orthopedic, that basically reproduce this type of alienation, right? So now like health is you go home and you're like, I am a good housewife. I'm going to be a good housewife. God damn it, I'm going to be a great housewife, right? That these are just, bad, toxic. They actually lock you into what you were, they present as health, what you were previously experiencing as a problem. Then the question is, what does his psychoanalysis do? How does it operate? How might it offer if not an ethical answer or alternative, but some sort of reconfiguration of the problem? And that's where he's about to go.
Can I just say, I was thinking about his critique of ego psychology, and especially now that you're articulating in terms of like ego equals health, or like intact or integrated ego equals health. I'm teaching I'm teaching Nietzsche right now, and as we were reading Nietzsche's attempt at a self-criticism, which is something he appended to his book, The Birth of Tragedy, 16 years after he wrote it. And there's this line, I'm paraphrasing mostly. I don't have the book in front of me, but something like, we'll have to ask the psychiatrist, is there such a thing as a neurosis of health?
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, that's kind of like exactly what Lacan is getting at here.
There's a very funny paper I sometimes assign to my students, which I think it was composed in the run-up to the DSM-5 that uses DSM-style criteria to argue that happiness is actually a pathological condition that can be differentially diagnosed and is comparatively rare. And a lot of it involves like unrealistic expectations, too much self-confidence, a weird contagious thing. Like, it's an ironic tongue-in-cheek thing, right? But
we'll drop it in the show notes.
Yeah. Now we finally arrive at what I think are like the most beautiful parts of the essay, but also like the most profound philosophical implications of it, or at least working with it insofar as that, well, there are lots of critiques of the Cartesian cogito.
Sure.
Right. And he promised big, right? And he also layered on all these metaphors from biology to development and pediatrics to religion to classical mythology and myths of destiny to the political stakes of identity and identification in the world of nationalisms in the 20th century and beyond.
You forgot castles.
And castles and an entire like Christmas songs worth of animals that you could buy for somebody, right? He now suggests that perhaps, and here we're returning to that the we of psychoanalytic experience, we offer something different, he seems to say.
At this intersection of nature and culture, so obstinately scrutinized by the anthropology of our times, psychoanalysis alone recognizes the knot of imaginary servitude that love must always untie anew or sever. For such a task, we can find no promise in altruistic feeling. We who lay bare the aggressiveness that underlies the philanthropist, the idealist, the pedagogue, and even the reformer.
These are remarkably 2 sentences here, right? The first one situates psychoanalysis, or at least the psychoanalysis that Lacan is selling here, as, well, if what the story of the mirror stage tells us, and what the examples of Lacan's version of ego psychology or of predatory systems of social reproduction suggest, is a subject who is continually, so to speak, enthralled to imaginary constructions of self, but also to imposed narratives of who it must be and who it must become, etc. Psychoanalysis, well, recognizes that constitutive knot and takes the work of actually changing that as to be a kind of love, of severing that knot, but also of retying it, or this work of continually working back and forth, right, is a caring gesture. But it's a difficult caring gesture insofar as that, among other things, well, if we do this, and this is, callbacks to Freud, apocryphally bringing the United States to the plague, if we're serious about this theory of the subject, that would involve us thinking very critically about the idealizations or fictions of self, the authenticity logics that determine even people who we admire, or even systems of thought that we admire. We want to assess how might they both reflect this trap, but speak to us in terms of how we are constituted by this trap.
Yeah. Right.
So these are all the reformer, the teacher, the philanthropist. They're like, this is what the human is. This is who you are. Allow me to help you find your true self. Let me get you to the promised land. Right. These are all things that Lacan says, well, you're gonna wind up feeling a little differently about those people and their appeal if we do psychoanalysis in the mode I want to do it. And that brings us to the final, and I think the most haunting line of the essay.
Yeah, you love this line.
I love it.
Where he's giving you, what is it that Lacanians can offer? In the subject-to-subject recourse we preserve, psychoanalysis can accompany the patient to the ecstatic limits of the thou art that, where the cipher of his mortal destiny is revealed to him. But it is not in our sole power as practitioners to bring him to the point where the true journey begins.
So that thou art that, right? It's powerful. And it's a line that's hard to, the entire line itself is so overdetermined with language that is mystical and religious.
Well, it's actually from the Upanishads, the thou art that. It's from Advaita Vedanta, and it's about the we've been talking so much about how the self does not coincide with the self. This is about the self, Atman, as being in a meaningful way contiguous with Brahman, with the universe, right? So there is the individual self as resonating and indeed being isomorphic with the structure of the universe there. It's like the sort of example of not only do I coincide with myself, but I also fit in this world.
No, that whatever the role of the psychoanalyst is here, they're not taking you to that moment of like literal, like to like truth and just being like, okay, that's who you really are.
Right.
This is who you were all along. Buddy, no, you were this other type of other, right? It's not a discourse of top down, giving someone a new, corrected, better, superior, more adaptive, more orthopedic vision of who they are or should be, nor still is it like the delivery of mystical truth in like some sort of guru kind of mode, like I'm going to hand this to you, nor still is it a ratification of these previously troped ideas of like either biological destiny or of like predestination in the religious sort of Protestant sense, or as the perils of assumption of taking something on in its Catholic senses either, right? Yeah. There are all these ways in which like the search for identity or the search for self-identity is now taking on the broadest possible tonalities. And Lacan is saying, I'm not going to give you a definite answer, or psychoanalysis is not going to give you a definite answer, but it's going to do something else.
I keep thinking about this Gestalt. If you look at a brand new connect the dots page, and it's just dots, and that's it. But then without using a pen or a marker, your ability to guess what the image is that the dots are wanting you to draw would be like forming that Gestalt in your mind of these dots. But otherwise, they are just dots on a page. There's something about to experience yourself as an individual would be to recognize yourself as just the dots on the page. And the act of connecting those dots is the act of like metabolizing history and future through lenses of interpretation that are given to you by the other, or lenses of expectation and interpretation that are given to you by the other.
The figure in those dots, right, is a fiction. But also, we live in time and we assume these fictions, these destinies have consequences for us. And so you can't totally redraw that dot thing from scratch. Like your face is aged in certain ways, or you've taken on scars, but you can potentially reorient a little bit. You can shape it up.
So how do you read the very final part of this? The true journey, right? That like, it's not in our soul power as practitioners to bring him, the patient, to the point where the true journey begins. Lacan has been making sort of a mockery of any idea of or of any sense of like the true self, since we began this essay many years ago now. So how do you read this last bit about the point where the true journey begins?
I think with an eye towards like the ethical stakes that this essay built towards, and with an eye towards this tragic drama of like a subject being continually searching for a thing that they are not, or like mislocating or misdirecting their energies to variously shore up or locate or put back together a constraining vision of self that is actually more often than not given to them by other people.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
That what we're talking about here is a recognition of the contingency of those different appeals or those different like interpolations into logics of identity, and a kind of recognition of the destinies or identities that you have entered into or even accepted as though they were naturally given. Mm-hmm. And now what you get to do is you can inventory those, and as opposed to simply taking them to be who you are and who you have to be, you can now choose them as possibilities of ways you can go, but your relationship to that is not necessarily one of insufficiency trying to achieve, but rather like crossing over or like cutting through them, what you might call traversing.
Yeah, it's a kind of loosening up.
Yeah. Think about it in the sense, I don't want to give too crude examples, right? But one of them might just be like, well, some people have been telling you that you have to be a particular way your entire life. You've thought to understand yourself as, I don't know, a patriotic American serviceman, right? Or a sinful lesbian who can only ever, attain the like entrance into heaven if you maintain a straight marriage within a restrictive Christian fundamentalist church. Or that you're always going to be a fuck up. That these are things that are, well, they weigh on you, right? Sometimes they're, they may be like, oh, you're always the best, right? And of course that can haunt you in other ways too. And there's narcissism as an element in this paper. We can talk about that. And when we talk about narcissism, we'll come back to it. But here he really seems to be being like, here are all these different identifications and traps that you've been in. And you've spent so much energy exerting yourself against these strictures and trying to be this thing, trying to either prove to yourself that you're something or to prove to other people that you're something, then now at least you can redistribute those energies elsewhere. And I think here, to give an example about like how this is painful, right? And why people are thankless. He says it's a thankless thing sometimes, right? Is that imagine like an animal, it's caught in a trap, right? It's biting in all sorts of directions. It may bite you when you try and let it out. And then when you let it out, you don't necessarily know where it's going to go. You don't like literally put it in another trap. Where it goes is where it's going to go. But it's even more difficult and painful than that because, well, sure, these identity categories aren't real in some sense. Like there is no like, I don't know what they power Captain America on, but there isn't like an essential essence of true American or like midi-chlorians that make you into a patriotic Jedi or something, right? There isn't like a thing. But still, we spend a lot of our lives trying to be certain things. And we make choices that are real, that have consequences for our finite and infallible bodies and our frail efforts to love and care and experiment. And we make choices and commitments to other people. And part of the pain of like recognizing how many of those choices that you made may not have been fully, well, that they may have been choices that were made for you or choices that you didn't realize you were making, but in any event, they were choices that you did make in terms of the consequences, is that instead of giving you like this impossible new freedom where it's like, okay, now you're going to go back and become that baby and you're going to love your body again, right? Or you're going to be that schizophrenic taking a walk and everything's hunky-dory, you now have to, well, possibly do things like mourn things that you couldn't have become. You have to recognize the situation in which you're in, right? You have to, maybe you're going to leave that marriage and that's what you need to do and that's your choice and good for you, but you'll never be 18 again. You won't find that soulmate or whatever that you thought you were, because, et cetera, right? There are entire pathways themselves that get mourned.
Yeah.
And that, I think, also raises the possibility, and this is another one for us to think about, that a person could have a experience of being like, okay, these are these identity categories which have caused me so much pain, and now I understand them, and I'm still going to choose them, or I'm going to choose them even more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the ethical complexity, or like the ethical problem, which is like a problem of living, of psychoanalysis, as I think anybody conceives it too. I don't think this is just about Lacan, right? Which is that at the end of the day, you can help a person develop more capacities for reflection, for insight, for changing their relationships, or for changing how they relate to their relationships, above all to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't guarantee outcomes, and you can't make them do anything, and you can't undo the past. But you exist now in a position of, well, authenticity is hard to talk about here now, right? But at least you were more in tune with it and you were less deluded by it. And that way, there's something very classically Freudian here too, right? Because for the Freudian injunction, well, one, there's a Hippocratic oath. You heal the person regardless of what you might or might not dislike about them, right? That the person who decides that they want to stay closeted, or the person who decides that actually, yes, I'm an airman who, instead of doing a protest, I'm going to get into a plane and pull a John McCain, and after I see what napalm does to people, I'm going to go napalm some more people, right? People make their choices, but at least it's not stuck. At least it's not always the same choice, and now it's your choice.
It seems to me, just listening to you, that you find something both honest. I hesitate to say like liberatory because that's almost too hopeful, but let's at least say like freeing or loosening up here. Is that right?
It's not a coincidence, I think, that, well, when he invokes the concept of the mirror stage, a figure like Frantz Fanon will talk about it in terms of the alienations that are imposed by racist colonialism on the colonized subject.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I also don't think it's a coincidence either that when Winnicott will talk about the mirror stage, he'll do that to describe certain forms of like failed mirroring, but also of like basically kind of sad developmental cases where a child identifies with, what the parents want them to be over and against what the parents should be attending to in terms of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we read this paper as being about recognition, identity, and alienation, and the power of those things in the broadest senses, from alienation of under capital to the alienation of Chez Fanon, to the alienations of like, well, that feeling when you look at the photo of your family and you're like, wow, I wish I had been there. And actually, I wish I had been was a place which is not actually the place where I was that was photographed, right?
Yeah.
You are now disabused of certain illusions, or you rather have the capacity to, now that you kind of see what alienation is, you can embark on this difficult work of, well, I would call it disalienation.
Right.
Or we might call it perhaps something like finding solidarity in others. Because it's not like that basic problem of the self-understanding mediation through others is solved. It's not solved. You never exit the mirror stage in that sense.
Right.
But now, at least, instead of relating to others through terms of, well, you have to be this, you're an American, or like, you can't talk to them, or like, how you're a productive member of society, you're a worker, you should step over that homeless person. On some level, changing how you relate to yourself can change how you relate to others, or acknowledging the anxieties that other people have over their own identities, or hell, acknowledging the ways in which even recognition of identity category can come with its own pains or insufficiencies or not fix certain things. Mm-hmm. That could allow us to form new coalitions, or at least to interact with one another in ways that both produce gains in certain structures, that produce gains in terms of recognition and identification of various categories, but that also gives us an ongoing resource of connecting with one another through the engagement with, well, non-identity, but also our desires to identify,
right,
and open up new identifications. And that's a work of psychoanalysis. And we could either see psychoanalysis as having a role in that in a broader radical project, or we could see the radical project as involving some sort of working through those issues.
Well, if recognition is always misrecognition, you can read that as a cause for despair. And you're allowed to. We're not going to stop you, right? But I think, Patrick, following the line of thinking that you are, what that actually can produce is also a sort of the recognition that one's perception of the other and the self is always going to be is non-identical with some sort of real version of all of those others, of the many myriad others that surround you. That there can be, and I mean this word in none of it's Christian valences, a certain amount of grace that emerges from that idea. If instead of being sort of wedded to the idea of like, I see you, I understand you, I see you, I see myself, I understand myself, that there's again this sort of like loosening. If you understand that baked into all of those interactions with intraself and also interpersonal and political, that sense that there's always going to be an otherness, there's always going to be misrecognition. There's actually a certain flexibility and solace and a sense of letting the other be other.
It allows us to work more gracefully with concepts like identity or identity claims, right? Simultaneously to honor the anxieties or needs that can underwrite them. and they need to redress them, but also to understand the ways in which those can follow certain types of traps. It allows us to, and I think this is probably even the more important thing, to recognize the ways in which we are constantly being recruited into narratives of who we are that actually produce real antagonisms and perpetuate them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think on some very basic level, what this does, and what I think reading this essay in the way we have can affect, if only as like a poetic exercise or as a tearing with a fable or lingering with a difficult thought. And I think you have to slow down to see this, right? To get this sense. And you have to both slow down to see it, but then you have to be able to return to that sense that basically things don't have to be this way. You do not have to be the way that you are. The people around you are also struggling or variously denying they're struggling or resolving their struggling problematically with the anxieties of who they are and how the world is. There's a tremendous amount of contingency in the world. And if we're able to see past how much we are given as newness is actually repetition, and how much we are given as choices is actually a ratification of things that are beyond our control and which we have no choice over, then we can connect with one another and imagine new possibilities without that same element of fundamentally fixed, captured, tragic predetermination.
Thank you for listening to Ordinary Unhappiness. If you would like to unlock 2 more episodes per month, you can join us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This podcast is entirely supported by our Patreon members. We deeply, deeply appreciate your support and also your rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred podcast platform is. We will be back next week with the standard edition. The Fleece Chronicles will continue. And Freud is having some issues with identity. He's really worried that everything he has thought up until now is wrong. So you're not going to want to miss it. See you then. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.